June 11, 1892 marked the beginning of a violent trajectory that would eventually terminate at a rock formation in the California wilderness. The air near Pixley sat heavy with the smell of dry grass and the metallic tang of the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks stretching across the San Joaquin Valley. At exactly 11:15 in the evening, the silence of the flatlands shattered when a massive explosion rocked the express car of the northbound train. Chris Evans and John Sontag stood in the shadows of the water tank, their faces obscured by makeshift masks, watching the wooden door of the car splinter under the force of the dynamite. The engineer, a man named Jones, stood with his hands raised high while the cold barrel of a Winchester rifle pressed into the small of his back. The immediate aftermath of the blast sent a plume of thick, acrid smoke into the night sky, visibility dropping to near zero within the immediate vicinity of the tracks. John Sontag moved, with a mechanical efficiency, his boots crunching on the gravel ballast as he approached the dazed messenger inside the car. This was not a tentative act, but a calculated strike against a corporation they viewed as a predatory monolith. The messenger, George Roberts, lay on the floorboards with blood trickling from his ears due to the concussive force of the blast. He did not offer resistance as the Outlaws began searching for the heavy throughway safes that contained the monthly payroll for the northern mines. Outside the train, the passengers remained locked in their coaches, the sound of their frantic whispers drowned out by the hissing of steam from the locomotive's safety valves. Chris Evans kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, scanning for any sign of a local posse or a railroad detective. He held his firearm with a grip that had been hardened by years of manual labor and previous skirmishes. The grit from the valley floor blew into his eyes, but he did not blink, remaining focused on the perimeter while Sontag worked the interior of the express car. They were operating in a region they knew intimately, every gully and irrigation ditch serving as a potential path for a quick withdrawal. The heist at 7 Mile Switch was characterized by a lack of verbal communication between the two men, who had rehearsed the motions until they were instinctual. Sontag found the primary safe but realized the explosive charge had jammed the locking mechanism rather than blowing it clean off. He growled a low command to Evans indicating they needed more time, but the sound of a distant whistle signaled the approach of a second train on the same line. The logistical window was closing rapidly. They had to decide between risking a head-on collision or retreating with whatever loose currency they had managed to shove into their canvas bags. They opted for a swift exit, disappearing into the darkness just as the first lanterns of the train crew began to bob toward the wreckage. They did not head toward the main roads, instead cutting across the open fields toward the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The ground was uneven, filled with squirrel holes and thickets of brush that snagged at their heavy coats. Every step was a deliberate choice to move further from the civilization that the Southern Pacific Railroad represented. Behind them, the sounds of shouting grew fainter, replaced by the rhythmic thumping of their own hearts and the steady percussion of their boots hitting the packed earth. By 2 in the morning on June 12th, the duo reached a prearranged point where horses were tethered in a dense grove of oak trees. The animals were restless, sensing the tension radiating from the men. Evans swung into the saddle with a practiced motion, his eyes already turning toward the east where the jagged silhouette of the mountains offered the only true sanctuary. They knew the telegraph wires would already be humming with news of the robbery, sending descriptions of their height, weight, and gear to every lawman from Fresno to Bakersfield. The hunt was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a physical reality that would define the next several months of their lives. The railroad company responded with a level of financial aggression that matched the violence of the robbery. They immediately authorized the hiring of specialized detectives and offered a bounty that would tempt even the most loyal neighbors to turn informant. This was the era of the professional manhunter, where technology like the telegraph allowed the law to travel faster than a horse could gallop. Will Smith, a railroad detective with a reputation for tenacity, arrived at the scene of the robbery by dawn to begin the process of tracking. He knelt by the tracks, examining the spent casings and the specific way the dynamite had been applied to the safe door. Back in Visalia, the social fabric began to tear as word of the robbery spread through the saloons and general stores. Chris Evans was a known man in the community, a family man with a wife and children, which made the accusation seem both impossible and inevitable to those who knew his grievances against the railroad. The duality of his life, a respected citizen by day and a masked bandit by night, created a tension that permeated the local atmosphere. Friends and neighbors began to look at one another with suspicion, wondering who would be the first to crack under the pressure of the impending investigation. The terrain of the San Joaquin Valley in 1892 was a labyrinth of dusty trails and seasonal creeks that could hide a man for days if he knew how to read the land. Sontag and Evans utilized this to their advantage, moving through the shadows of the foothills while avoiding the main thoroughfares. They relied on a network of sympathetic homesteaders who provided them with fresh water and occasional intelligence on the movements of the law. These encounters were brief and conducted in hushed tones, the exchange of a few silver coins for a bucket of grain or a slab of salted pork. As the first week of the pursuit unfolded, the physical toll on the outlaws became apparent. Their clothes were caked with the white dust of the valley, and their faces were etched with the fatigue of constant vigilance. They slept in shifts, one man always holding a rifle while the other caught a few hours of fitful rest on the hard ground. The sound of a snapping twig or the hoot of an owl was enough to bring them to a state of full readiness. This was the reality of the fugitive life, a slow erosion of the senses and a hardening of the spirit against the elements and the ever-present threat of capture. Detective Will Smith was not easily deterred by the rugged landscape or the evasive tactics of his prey. He assembled a posse of men who were experienced in the high country, including individuals who could track a mountain lion over bare rock. They moved with a clinical precision, mapping out the possible routes the outlaws could take. Smith understood that the key to catching Sontag and Evans was not just speed, but the ability to anticipate their next move based on their need for supplies and their known connections in the area. The heat of the California summer began to intensify, the mercury rising to over 100 degrees by midday. This environmental pressure added a layer of brutality to the hunt, as water sources became scarce and the horses began to flag. The outlaws were forced to push higher into the mountains where the air was thinner but the cover was more substantial. They found temporary refuge in abandoned mining cabins and natural caves, their existence reduced to the most basic elements of survival. The mental strain of being hunted by an invisible but relentless force began to manifest in their frequent, terse arguments about their next destination. In the towns below, the legal machinery was turning just as relentlessly as the physical pursuit. Warrants were issued and the identities of the robbers were confirmed through a series of witnesses who had seen two men matching their descriptions near Pixley on the night of the 11th. The narrative of the outlaws as folk heroes began to emerge among some of the local populace, while others saw them as nothing more than violent criminals who threatened the stability of the region. This divide would play a crucial role in the months to come, as information became the most valuable currency in the valley. By the end of June, the initial fervor of the chase had transitioned into a grim stalemate. The posse had lost the trail in the rocky reaches of the Sierras, and the outlaws had disappeared into the vastness of the wilderness. However, the pressure never truly lifted. The bounty remained, and the railroad detectives continued to sit in the dark corners of Visalia waiting for a single slip-up. The event at 7 Mile Switch had set in motion a chain of events that could only end in a violent confrontation. The Outlaws had crossed a line that the Southern Pacific Railroad would not allow them to recross, and the law was prepared to spend whatever amount of time and money was necessary to see the account settled. The technology of the era played a dual role in this conflict. While the Outlaws used the brute force of dynamite and the reliability of the Winchester, the law used the speed of the rail and the reach of the telegraph. It was a clash between the old ways of the frontier and the emerging industrial order. Every time a message was tapped out over the wires, the circle around Sontag and Evans tightened slightly, even if they were miles away in the brush. They were fighting against an organization that had the resources of a nation behind it, a fact that Evans understood better than his younger partner. The brutality of the situation was not confined to the physical exchange of fire. It was found in the long nights of freezing temperatures in the high altitudes, the gnawing hunger that came when supplies ran low, and the psychological weight of knowing that every person they encountered could be the one to betray them. The Outlaws became increasingly isolated, their world shrinking to the size of their immediate surroundings and the range of their weapons. They were no longer just men. They were symbols of a dying era of the West, resisting the encroachment of a system they could no longer outrun. As July approached, the intensity of the sun turned the foothills into a brown, parched landscape. The golden grass was dry enough to ignite with a single spark, and the creek beds were mostly empty channels of cracked mud. Sontag and Evans were forced to move more frequently to find water, which increased the risk of being spotted. They stayed off the ridges, sticking to the deep canyons where the shadows lingered longer into the morning. Their movements were those of hunted predators, silent and efficient, every sense tuned to the environment for any anomaly that might indicate the presence of a posse. Meanwhile, the law was restructuring its approach. Recognizing that a large, noisy posse was unlikely to catch the Outlaws in the mountains, they began using smaller, more mobile units. These groups were designed to stay in the field for weeks at a time, living off the land and maintaining a constant presence in the areas where Sontag and Evans were likely to emerge. This shift in strategy increased the danger for the fugitives, as they could no longer rely on hearing the approach of a dozen horses from a mile away. The threat was now quiet, patient, and persistent. The financial impact of the hunt was also being felt in the local economy. The railroad was spending thousands of dollars on the pursuit, money that flowed into the hands of local guides, stable owners, and merchants. This created a complex web of incentives where some people wanted the Outlaws caught for the reward, while others benefited from the hunt continuing. Amidst this, the families of the Outlaws were subjected to constant surveillance and harassment, their homes searched and their movements tracked by deputies who hoped to find a clue to the men's whereabouts. In late July, a brief skirmish occurred near a mountain pass when a small scouting party from the posse caught a glimpse of two figures moving through the timber. Shots were exchanged at a distance of 300 yards, the echoes of the rifles rolling through the canyon like thunder. No one was hit, but the encounter served as a stark reminder that the law was never far behind. The Outlaws retreated deeper into the granite peaks, where the terrain was so rugged that even the most experienced trackers struggled to follow. They were entering a world of sheer cliffs and hidden basins, a place where the rules of the valley no longer applied. The physical condition of Sontag and Evans continued to decline. Their boots were worn through, the leather cracked, and the soles thin from miles of traversing rocky ground. Their skin was dark from the sun and lined with the stress of the journey. Despite the hardships, there was a grim determination in their actions. They had committed to a path that had no easy exit, and they were prepared to meet whatever end awaited them with the same violence that had started it all at 7 Mile Switch. As the narrative of the first month came to a close, the scale of the conflict had become clear. This was not a simple criminal pursuit, but a prolonged siege of the spirit. The outlaws were being squeezed by a combination of physical exhaustion, environmental hostility, and an industrial-strength manhunt. The stage was being set for the more intimate and bloody encounters that would follow, as the distance between the hunters and the hunted began to shrink. The silence of the Sierras was a temporary reprieve, a gathering of breath before the next explosion of violence that would eventually lead to the Stone Corral. The weight of the Winchester in Sontag's hand was a constant companion, a physical manifestation of his defiance. He looked at the mountain peaks ahead and then back at the valley they had left behind. There was no going back to the lives they had known. Every action from this point forward would be measured in the caliber of their ammunition and the speed of their reflexes. The hunt was the only thing that existed, a singular focus that stripped away everything but the necessity of the next hour's survival. They moved upward, leaving the dust of the valley for the cold stone of the high country, the first chapter of their flight concluding in the shadow of the great peaks. August 4th, 1892 arrived with a punishing heat that radiated off the parched soil of the Sierra Nevada foothills. Chris Evans and John Sontag had descended from the higher elevations to seek food and reliable information at the Evans family homestead near Visalia. They occupied a small, sturdy cabin on the property, a structure built from rough-hewn timber that smelled of sap and dry rot. The two men sat in the dim interior, the light filtering through the gaps in the window shutters in sharp geometric slivers. Their weapons lay across their laps, cleaned and oiled, the steel cold against their sun-scorched skin. They were aware that the railroad detectives had been watching the family, but the need for a hot meal and the comfort of familiar walls had outweighed the caution that had kept them alive for the past 2 months. At exactly 1:45 in the afternoon, the silence of the afternoon was punctured by the sound of horse hooves striking the sun-baked earth. A posse consisting of Deputy Will Smith, Deputy George Whitty, and a hired tracker named Oscar Beaver approached the cabin with their revolvers drawn and their eyes fixed on the door. They had received a tip from a local informant who had spotted the outlaws moving through the brush the previous evening. The lawmen did not call out a surrender. They moved in a staggered formation, utilizing the trunks of oak trees and the corners of outbuildings for cover. The physical tension in the air was thick, a precursor to the kinetic violence that was seconds away from erupting. John Sontag was the first to see the flash of a polished badge through a knothole in the cabin wall. He did not speak, instead nudging Evans and pointing toward the east side of the building. The outlaws moved with a lethal synchronization, sliding their rifle barrels through the firing slits they had prepared earlier that morning. The first shot came from the Posse, a high-caliber projectile that splintered the door frame and sent a shower of wooden shards into the room. Evans responded instantly, the roar of his Winchester filling the cramped space and pushing a cloud of white smoke toward the ceiling. The battle for the cabin had begun with a suddenness that left no room for tactical adjustment. Oscar Beaver, the tracker, attempted to rush the porch to gain a better vantage point for his shotgun. As he stepped into the open, a rifle projectile struck him in the chest, the force of the impact spinning him around before he collapsed into the dirt. He lay there, his breathing shallow and ragged, the red stain on his shirt widening with every second. The deputies realized they had underestimated the resolve and the marksmanship of the men inside. They shifted their positions, crawling through the dry grass to find better angles that would allow them to fire into the windows without exposing themselves to the return volleys. Inside the cabin, the temperature rose rapidly as the black powder smoke accumulated, making the air heavy and tasting of sulfur. Sontag felt a sharp pain in his shoulder, as a fragment of a copper-jacketed slug tore through the wall and grazed his collarbone. He did not flinch, merely adjusting his stance to put more weight on his back leg while he cycled the lever of his rifle. The brass casings ejected from the gun hit the floor with a rhythmic metallic clink, forming a small pile at his feet. They were trapped in a box of wood and stone, but the thickness of the logs provided a significant tactical advantage over the men exposed in the yard. Deputy Will Smith managed to reach the side of the house, pressing his back against the rough logs while he reloaded his revolver. He could hear the heavy breathing of the outlaws on the other side of the timber, a sound so intimate it felt like they were standing in the same room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a box of matches, intending to set fire to the dry tinder at the base of the cabin to force the men out. Before he could strike a light, Evans fired through the floorboards at a downward angle, the bullet passing through Smith's boot and shattering the small bones in his foot. Smith let out a guttural cry and tumbled backward, rolling toward a nearby equipment shed. The exchange of gunfire continued for 45 minutes without pause, the volume of noise attracting the attention of neighboring farmers who watched from the safety of distant ridges. The cabin was being systematically dismantled by the sheer weight of the ammunition being directed at it. The shutters were reduced to kindling, and the stone chimney began to chip away as heavy projectiles struck the mortar. Despite the damage, the outlaws remained mobile, shifting from the front room to the kitchen to keep the posse guessing about their exact locations. They used the heavy cast-iron stove as a secondary shield, the metal ringing like a bell every time it took a hit. By 2:30 in the afternoon, the physical condition of the combatants was deteriorating. The heat, combined with the stress of the firefight, caused sweat to pour down their faces, stinging their eyes and slicking their hands. Evans found it difficult to maintain a steady aim as the salt ran into the small cuts on his forehead caused by flying wood splinters. He shouted to Sontag to check the rear exit, a small door that led toward a steep gully filled with manzanita brush. If they were to survive, they had to break the perimeter before the deputies could send for reinforcements from Visalia. The deputies were also feeling the strain, their ammunition supplies running low after the initial frantic exchange. George Whitty looked at the prone form of Oscar Beaver and realized the tracker was dead, his eyes staring blankly at the harsh blue sky. The realization that this was a fight to the death rather than a standard arrest settled over the lawmen. They began to fire more conservatively, aiming for the gaps in the logs where they saw the occasional flash of a rifle barrel. The psychological pressure of the stalemate was mounting, each side waiting for the other to make a fatal tactical error. Sontag decided to create a diversion. He took a heavy wool blanket, soaked it in a bucket of wash water, and threw it over the stove to create a massive billow of steam and soot. In the resulting confusion, he and Evans kicked open the rear door and charged out toward the gully. The sunlight was blinding after the darkness of the cabin, but they did not stop to let their eyes adjust. They ran with a frantic energy, their heavy boots thudding against the earth as they dove into the thicket of brush. The posse spotted the movement and unleashed a final desperate volley of fire that tore through the leaves around the fleeing men. A single slug caught John Sontag in the side of the leg as he cleared the first line of trees. He stumbled, the muscle in his thigh tearing as the metal passed through, but the adrenaline masked the true extent of the injury. He scrambled back to his feet, leaning on a sturdy branch as he followed Evans into the deep shadows of the ravine. The deputies tried to pursue, but the uneven terrain and the threat of an ambush from the thick cover forced them to slow their pace. They had lost the immediate advantage of the surprise attack and were now facing a chase through a landscape the outlaws knew better than any map. The scent of blood and burnt powder followed the men as they pushed deeper into the foothills. Evans stopped briefly to check Sontag's wound, using a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt to create a makeshift bandage. The cloth turned crimson almost instantly, the blood soaking through the fabric and dripping onto the dry leaves. They could not afford to stop for proper medical attention. The sound of shouting from the cabin site indicated that the posse was organizing a follow-up search. They had to reach the higher elevations where the granite outcrops and hidden caves would provide a more defensible position. Back at the Evans cabin, the scene was one of total carnage. The structure was riddled with hundreds of holes, the interior a shambles of broken glass, shredded furniture, and discarded brass. The body of Oscar Beaver was moved to the shade of a tree, his death a stark testament to the brutality of the encounter. Deputy Will Smith sat on the ground, his mangled foot propped up on a crate, his face pale from shock and pain. He knew that the failure to capture the men here would only embolden them and make the eventual capture even more difficult and costly in terms of human life. The news of the gunfight at the cabin spread through the valley like a wildfire, reaching Visalia by 4 in the afternoon. The details were often exaggerated, with some reports claiming a dozen men had been killed on each side, but the core truth remained. Sontag and Evans had fought their way out of a trap and were back in the wild. The Southern Pacific Railroad responded by doubling the guards on their express cars and increasing the pressure on the United States Marshals to take over the investigation. This was no longer a local matter. It was a challenge to the authority of the state. As evening approached, the Outlaws found themselves on a high ridge overlooking the valley. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple, and the air began to cool, providing some relief to their overheated bodies. Sontag's leg had stiffened, the pain now a constant throbbing presence that made every movement an ordeal. They had no food, limited water, and their ammunition was significantly reduced. They sat in the dirt, their backs against a granite slab, watching the flickering lights of the town far below. They were isolated, wounded, and hunted, yet they were still free. The technology of the Posse, the high-velocity rifles, and the coordinated movements of the lawmen had failed to overcome the sheer desperation and environmental familiarity of the Outlaws. Evans looked at his Winchester, the barrel still warm to the touch, and realized that their survival would now depend on their ability to endure the unendurable. They were entering a phase of the hunt where the brutality of the elements would be just as dangerous as the guns of the Marshals. The physical reality of their situation was stripped of any romantic notions of the frontier. It was simply a matter of blood, bone, and the will to keep moving. The night brought a different kind of danger. The sound of mountain lions and the rustle of nocturnal predators kept them in a state of hyper-awareness. They took turns sleeping in 20-minute intervals, their hands never leaving their weapons. The darkness was not a shield, but a canvas for their fears, every shadow transforming into a deputy with a shotgun. Sontag's fever began to rise, his body fighting the infection starting in his leg wound. He drifted in and out of a light sleep, his mind filled with the echoes of the afternoon's gunfire and the sight of the tracker falling in the dirt. By 5 in the morning on August 5th, they reached a hidden spring they had used months before. The water was cold and clear, a luxury that felt more valuable than the gold they had stolen. They drank deeply, the liquid soothing their parched throats and washing the grit from their mouths. Evans cleaned Sontag's wound properly, using the cold water to flush out the dirt and debris. The bullet had missed the bone, but the muscle damage was extensive, leaving a jagged, angry hole that would take weeks to heal under the best conditions. They spent the day hidden in a dense thicket of scrub oak, watching the valley floor through binoculars they had managed to grab during their escape. They saw several parties of riders moving along the base of the foothills, their movements organized and purposeful. The law was not giving up. They were widening the net, hoping to catch the outlaws as they tried to move toward the higher peaks. The realization that they were being systematically hunted by a superior force of men who were being paid for their deaths was a heavy weight to carry. The historical context of this fight was rooted in the deep-seated resentment toward the railroad's land-grabbing policies. Many locals saw Evans and Sontag as defenders of the common man, which provided them with a layer of protection that the law found difficult to penetrate. However, the death of a man like Oscar Beaver, who was well liked in the community, began to shift the public perception. The brutality of the gunfight at the cabin showed that these were not just social rebels, but men who would kill anyone who stood in their way. The lines were being drawn more clearly with every drop of blood spilled. In the late afternoon, they began the climb toward the higher timberline. The terrain became steeper, the ground covered in loose shale that threatened to give way under their weight. Sontag had to use a sturdy walking stick, his progress slow and agonizing. Evans carried both rifles and the majority of their gear, his muscles screaming with the effort. They moved like ghosts through the forest, avoiding the established trails and sticking to the ridges where they could see for miles. Their world had narrowed to the next ridge, the next spring, and the next hour of survival. The sheer brute force of their escape from the cabin was a feat that would be discussed in the saloons of California for decades. They had faced a prepared ambush by experienced lawmen and had not only survived but had inflicted significant casualties. This success, however, came at a high cost. They were now marked men in a way they hadn't been before. The Battle of the Cabin had proved their lethality, but it had also ensured that the next time the law found them, there would be no attempt at negotiation. The Marshals would come with the intent to destroy them. As the second chapter of their journey into the Stone Corral ended, the Outlaws were deeper in the wilderness than they had ever been. The silence of the high Sierras was a stark contrast to the roar of the Winchester and the screams of the wounded men back at the homestead. They were becoming part of the landscape, their humanity being stripped away by the necessity of the hunt. They were no longer Chris Evans and John Sontag. They were the quarry, and the hounds were still on the scent, their baying echoing through the canyons of the San Joaquin. The physical reality of their injuries was a constant reminder of the stakes. Sontag's leg was a source of unrelenting pain, a physical anchor that threatened to drag them both down. Evans looked at his partner and saw the toll the last few days had taken. The eyes were sunken, the skin sallow, and the movements jerky. They were reaching the limits of human endurance, yet the terrain demanded more. They pushed upward, the cold wind of the high altitudes beginning to bite at their thin clothing, leaving the blood-soaked cabin far below in the heat of the valley. September 1st. 1892 began a period of profound isolation for Chris Evans and John Sontag as they retreated into the most inaccessible reaches of the Sierra Nevada. The transition from the scorching heat of the valley to the thin, biting air of the high timberline necessitated a change in their fundamental survival tactics. They moved through the Kings River Canyon, a massive geological rift where the granite walls towered 3,000 feet above the valley floor. Their primary objective was to put as much vertical distance between themselves and the law as possible. Sontag's leg wound had begun to close into a thick purple scar, but the muscle remained tight and prone to cramping during the steep ascents. They carried only what they could fit in their saddlebags: a few pounds of flour, some salt, a coffee tin, and several boxes of ammunition for their Winchester rifles. The physical environment of the high Sierras acted as a natural fortress, but it also presented a lethal set of challenges. By mid-September, the temperature at night frequently dropped below the freezing point, turning the small mountain streams into sheets of slick ice. The Outlaws possessed no heavy winter gear, relying instead on multiple layers of wool and the heat of small shielded fires. They constructed a series of temporary camps in the upper reaches of the sequoia groves, using the massive trunks of the ancient trees to block the wind. These camps were never occupied for more than 2 consecutive nights to prevent the development of a predictable pattern that a tracker could exploit. Every morning they used pine branches to sweep away their footprints from the soft duff of the forest floor. The search for the Outlaws had evolved into a high-stakes logistical operation funded by the Southern Pacific Railroad. A bounty of $5,000 was officially posted, a sum that represented a lifetime of earnings for most laborers in 1892. This financial incentive turned the local mountains into a hunting ground for professional mercenaries and desperate locals alike. Small groups of armed men, often called vigilance committees, patrolled the lower passes, hoping to catch the outlaws if they descended for supplies. The outlaws were forced to rely on a few trusted associates who would leave caches of food in prearranged locations such as hollow logs or under specific rock overhangs. These transactions were silent and anonymous, conducted without any face-to-face contact to ensure plausible deniability for the sympathizers. In October 1892, the first major snowstorm of the season swept across the peaks, depositing 2 feet of heavy, wet powder in a single night. This weather event significantly restricted the mobility of both the hunted and the hunters. Evans and Sontag found a semi-permanent shelter in a natural rock cave located near the headwaters of the Kaweah River. The cave was narrow and deep, providing protection from the wind but offering no source of warmth other than their own bodies. They spent hours huddled together in the darkness, listening to the muffled roar of the wind outside. The lack of sunlight and the constant dampness began to take a toll on their mental state, creating a sense of claustrophobia that the vastness of the mountains could not alleviate. Dietary deficiency became a critical issue as the winter deepened. They were unable to hunt large game like deer or bear, as the report of a rifle would echo for miles in the crisp mountain air and alert any nearby posses. Instead, they survived on small rodents, squirrels, and birds trapped using wire snares. The nutritional value was minimal, and both men began to lose weight rapidly, their faces becoming gaunt and their ribs protruding. Evans, the older of the two, suffered from recurring bouts of rheumatism in his joints, which made the act of reloading his firearm or even standing up a painful process. Sontag took over most of the physical labor, gathering firewood during the brief windows of daylight and melting snow for drinking water. The technological disparity between the fugitives and the law grew during these months. While the outlaws were trapped in a primitive state of survival, the United States Marshals were utilizing the latest in communications. They established a relay system of riders to carry messages from the mountain outposts to the nearest telegraph stations. This allowed the law to coordinate their movements with a level of precision that was previously impossible. Maps were meticulously updated with every reported sighting, creating a shrinking perimeter around the outlaws' suspected territory. The railroad company also provided the deputies with the highest quality optics available, allowing them to scan the distant ridges for the telltale smoke of a campfire or the movement of a pack animal. Communication between Evans and Sontag was reduced to the bare essentials during the coldest months. They spoke in low whispers, discussing the status of their ammunition and the remaining amount of flour. The psychological pressure of the bounty was a constant presence in their thoughts. They knew that even their closest allies might be tempted by the $5,000. This suspicion led them to avoid even the established cache sites for weeks at a time, preferring to starve rather than risk walking into a trap. The isolation was absolute. They had no news of the outside world, no knowledge of their family's well-being, and no indication of how long the railroad intended to maintain the pursuit. By December 1892, the snow in the high passes reached a depth of 10 feet, making travel by horse impossible. The outlaws were forced to abandon their remaining mounts, which were becoming a liability due to their need for forage. They turned the horses loose in a lower valley, hoping the animals would find their way to a ranch where they might be cared for. This left the men on foot, their movements limited to the immediate vicinity of their cave. They used makeshift snowshoes constructed from willow branches and rawhide to navigate the drifts, a slow and exhausting method of travel that left them vulnerable if they were ever forced to make a quick escape. The physical reality of their existence was one of constant, grinding discomfort. Their clothing was never fully dry, the moisture from the snow and their own breath freezing into a crust of ice on their collars and cuffs. They suffered from chilblains on their fingers and toes, the skin turning red and itchy before blistering. Sontag's earlier leg injury ached in the cold, the scar tissue pulling against the muscle. Despite these hardships, there was a grim mechanical determination to their routine. They cleaned their rifles every day, ensuring that the firing pins were free of grease that might thicken and cause a misfire in the sub-zero temperatures. The Winchester was more than a weapon. It was their only link to the world of the living. In January 1893, a period of exceptionally clear weather allowed the sun to hit the granite faces of the mountains, causing massive avalanches that thundered through the canyons. One such slide occurred within 500 yards of their cave, the force of the moving snow snapping ancient pines like toothpicks and filling the air with a fine, suffocating powder. The outlaws watched from the mouth of their shelter, realizing that the environment was just as likely to kill them as the Marshals. This event served as a reminder of their insignificance in the face of the Sierras. They were merely two small figures clinging to the side of a mountain, surviving on the margins of a landscape that was indifferent to their struggle. The law did not remain idle during the winter. Marshal George E. Guard took command of the operation, establishing a base in Visalia where he could centralize the intelligence coming in from the field. He began a policy of systematic harassment of any individual known to have ties to the Evans or Sontag families. Homes were raided at midnight and supplies were confiscated under the suspicion that they were intended for the outlaws. This strategy was designed to isolate the fugitives from their support network, turning the winter into a weapon of attrition. Guard understood that as long as the outlaws stayed in the high country, they were effectively imprisoned by the snow. He was content to wait for the spring thaw when they would be forced to descend for food. Internal tension between Evans and Sontag surfaced occasionally during the long nights. Evans, whose family remained in the valley below, felt the weight of his absence more acutely than Sontag. He would sit for hours staring into the embers of their fire, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. Sontag, younger and more impulsive, grew frustrated with the inactivity. He wanted to strike back, to descend into the towns and raid the railroad offices once more. These arguments never escalated into violence, as both men recognized that their survival was entirely dependent on their partnership. They were two halves of a single organism, and a split would mean certain death for both. The brutality of their situation was reflected in their appearance. Their hair and beards grew long and matted with dirt. Their skin took on a leathery, weather-beaten texture, and their eyes were perpetually bloodshot from the smoke of the fires and the glare of the snow. They looked less like men and more like the predatory animals they shared the mountains with. This transformation was not just physical. Their mindset had hardened into a singular focus on evasion. Every sound, the crack of a frozen branch, the cry of a hawk, the distant rumble of a rock slide, was analyzed for its potential threat. They lived in a state of hypervigilance that left no room for any other emotion. February 1893. A freak warming trend known as a Chinook wind swept through the region, causing a rapid melt of the lower snowpack. This created a window of opportunity for the outlaws to move. They left their cave and began a perilous descent toward the foothills, hoping to find a cache that had been promised by a contact in the mining camps. The terrain was a treacherous mix of slush and mud, making every step a gamble. They crossed the North Fork of the Kings River, the water waist-deep and filled with floating chunks of ice. The cold was so intense that it felt like their skin was being flayed by the current, but they pushed through, reaching the far bank and disappearing into the dense cedar groves. They found the cache hidden in a derelict mining shaft. It contained 20 pounds of salted beef, 2 sacks of dry beans, and a small amount of tobacco. For the first time in months, they ate a full meal, the salt and protein providing a surge of energy that they hadn't felt since the previous autumn. This small victory bolstered their spirits and reaffirmed their belief that they could outlast the railroad. They spent 2 days in the mine shaft, repairing their boots and drying their clothes before moving back into the higher elevations. They knew the Marshals would find the tracks in the mud once the weather cooled again, so they had to be miles away before the next freeze. The financial scale of the hunt continued to escalate. By March 1893, the Southern Pacific Railroad had spent over $10,000 on the pursuit, a figure that was widely reported in the San Francisco newspapers. This public knowledge added to the legend of Sontag and Evans, casting them as elusive ghosts who could not be caught by the combined might of the law and the corporation. This reputation was a double-edged sword. While it intimidated some of the smaller posse, it only increased the resolve of men like William Guard, who saw the Outlaws as a stain on the professional reputation of the Marshals service. As the spring equinox approached, the physical landscape began to change once more. The days grew longer, and the first signs of green appeared on the southern slopes. The Outlaws moved into the more rugged areas near the Stone Corral, a natural rock formation they had scouted months before. It was a site of massive boulders and narrow crevices, providing excellent cover and multiple lines of retreat. They began to stockpile ammunition and dried meat at this location, sensing that the final confrontation would likely take place in this terrain. The isolation of the winter was ending, and the era of direct engagement was about to resume. The historical context of the San Joaquin Valley was one of rapid industrialization, and the Outlaws were a remnant of a more chaotic past. As they looked down from the ridges, they could see the steam from the locomotives cutting across the valley floor, a visual representation of the power they were fighting. The railroad tracks were the veins of the new California, and the Outlaws were an obstruction in that system. This realization did not lead to despair, but rather a sharpening of their resolve. They were prepared to die in the rocks of the Sierras rather than submit to the laws of the Southern Pacific. By April 1893, the snow had retreated to the highest peaks and the mountain trails were open once again. The Marshals intensified their patrols, using Native American trackers from the nearby reservations, who could read the subtle signs of passage that white men missed. These trackers were able to identify the specific wear patterns of the Outlaws' boots, allowing them to follow a trail even across stony ground. The circle was beginning to close. Evans and Sontag were no longer invisible. They were being actively trailed by men who understood the land as well as they did. The physical exertion of the spring movements was even greater than that of the winter. They were constantly on the move, covering 20 miles a day through vertical terrain to shake off their pursuers. Their boots were falling apart again, held together by strips of rawhide and wire. They were exhausted, hungry, and perpetually on the verge of being discovered. Yet they maintained their discipline. They never fired a shot unless absolutely necessary, and they never stayed in one place long enough for a posse to surround them. They were masters of the hit and run, utilizing the brute force of the landscape to compensate for their lack of numbers. In May 1893, they had a near encounter with a posse near the Mineral King district. They were spotted while crossing a ridge at dawn, and a running gunfight ensued through a forest of giant sequoias. The Outlaws used the massive trees as shields, trading shots with the deputies at ranges of over 400 yards. The sound of the Winchesters was deafening in the still morning air, the heavy, copper-jacketed projectiles thudding into the ancient wood. No one was hit, but the engagement proved that the law was now capable of finding them even in the most remote areas. The Outlaws retreated into a field of jagged granite, where the horses of the posse could not follow. The transition from the winter of evasion to the spring of conflict was complete. Evans and Sontag were now pinned against the foothills, their options for retreat becoming fewer with each passing day. They moved toward the Stone Corral with a sense of inevitability. The granite walls that had protected them through the snows were now becoming their final defensive position. The sheer relentlessness of the pursuit had pushed them to the edge of the map, into a place where the only outcomes were capture or death. They checked their rifles, counted their remaining rounds, and waited for the heat of June to bring the Marshals to their door. The winter of 1892 had not broken them, but it had refined them into something harder and more dangerous. They were no longer the men who had robbed the train at 7 Mile Switch. They were survivalists who had endured the worst the Sierras could throw at them. As the sun began to bake the valley floor once more, the stage was set for the encounter that would solidify their place in the history of the Old West. The Stone Corral was waiting, a silent witness to the impending violence that would erupt when the law finally caught up to the outlaws in the dust and heat of June 1893. June 1st, 1893 witnessed the arrival of United States Marshal George E. Gard at the Regional Command Center in Visalia. He stepped off the Southern Pacific locomotive into a wall of heat that registered 104 degrees on the station thermometer. His primary objective was the systematic elimination of the threat posed by Chris Evans and John Sontag through a coordinated multi-agency effort. Gard carried a leather portfolio containing topographical maps of the Sierra Nevada foothills and physical descriptions of the fugitives provided by railroad detectives. He immediately convened a meeting with local deputies to assess the available intelligence and the physical condition of the men under his command. The atmosphere in Visalia was thick with the scent of dry dust and the exhaust from the steam engines idling in the yard. Gard established his headquarters in a brick building near the courthouse, a structure that provided a modicum of insulation against the escalating temperatures of the San Joaquin Valley. He demanded daily reports from every sheriff in the surrounding counties, creating a centralized data point for all sightings and suspected movements. The marshal understood that the previous failures to capture the outlaws were rooted in a lack of communication and a tendency for posses to operate independently. He intended to replace this fragmented approach with a rigid military-style hierarchy that prioritized information over immediate confrontation. Gard's personal gear was representative of the professional lawman of the late 19th century, focusing on utility and durability over aesthetics. He wore a canvas duster to protect his clothing from the alkaline soil, and carried a Colt single-action army revolver with a 7.5-inch barrel. His primary weapon for the field was a Model 1892 Winchester chambered in .44-40, a rifle known for its reliability and its ability to share ammunition with his sidearm. He spent the first 48 hours in town reviewing the payroll for the special deputies, ensuring that only the most disciplined and experienced marksmen were retained for the final phase of the hunt. One of Gard's most significant tactical decisions was the recruitment of specialized Native American trackers from the Tool River Reservation. These men possessed a refined understanding of the local geology and the ability to distinguish between the tracks of wild animals and the specific weight distribution of a human foot carrying a heavy rifle. They were paid $3 a day, a high wage for the era, reflecting the value Gard placed on their specialized skills. He integrated these trackers into small 5-man scouting teams that were ordered to avoid combat and focus solely on locating the outlaws' current encampment. This shift toward reconnaissance marked a turning point in the efficiency of the pursuit. The mechanics of the tracking process involved a literal reading of the landscape that appeared featureless to the untrained eye. The trackers looked for shining, a term used to describe the way a flat stone reflects light differently once it has been overturned by a boot heel. They examined the needles of the ponderosa pines for microscopic tears in the bark caused by the passage of a rifle barrel or a canvas pack. In the arid conditions of early June, the lack of moisture meant that tracks did not hold their shape in the sand, forcing the trackers to rely on the displacement of pebbles and the crushing of dry moss. This was a slow, agonizingly precise form of labor that required the men to crawl on their hands and knees for miles. The Southern Pacific Railroad continued to exert immense pressure on the Marshals' office, viewing the Outlaws as a direct threat to their industrial sovereignty. The company provided Guard with an unlimited budget for supplies and the use of private rail cars to move men and horses rapidly between Visalia and the foothills. This technological advantage allowed the posse to maintain its physical strength while the Outlaws were forced to expend their energy on long cross-country marches. The railroad also maintained a private telegraph wire that bypassed the public stations, ensuring that Guard's orders could not be intercepted by any local sympathizers working in the telegraph offices. The logistical challenge of maintaining a posse in the scrubland during a heat wave required a constant supply of water and grain. Guard organized a mule train to carry hundreds of gallons of water in galvanized steel tanks, along with sacks of high-protein oats for the horses. Each deputy was issued a canteen made of tin and covered in wool, which, when soaked in water, provided a small degree of evaporative cooling. The physical toll on the men was evident in their cracked lips and the deep lines of salt that formed on their shirts. They were pushed to the limit of their endurance, yet the promise of the $5,000 bounty kept them from abandoning the trail. Among the prominent members of the posse was Vic Paquette, a man known for his cold temperament and his proficiency with a double-barreled shotgun. Paquette had been involved in several previous skirmishes with the Outlaws and viewed the hunt as a personal vendetta. He carried a Remington Model 1889, its barrels shortened to 20 inches for better maneuverability in the thick brush. Alongside him were men like Henderson and Hall, individuals who had spent years in the high country and were accustomed to the violence of the frontier. This core group formed the vanguard of the force that Guard intended to hammer against the rock formations of the Stone Corral. By June 3, 1893, the scouting teams reported a confirmed sighting of two men moving through a canyon exactly 12 miles northeast of Visalia. The description of the men's gait, one moving with a noticeable limp and the other carrying the bulk of the gear, matched Sontag and Evans perfectly. Guard did not immediately launch a frontal assault, fearing the Outlaws would simply disappear into the higher timber as they had done in the past. Instead, he ordered his teams to begin a wide flanking maneuver, effectively cordoning off the northern and eastern exits of the canyon. He was building a perimeter that would leave the Outlaws with only one logical path of retreat. The environmental conditions intensified as the first week of June progressed, with the sun bleaching the landscape into shades of gray and tan. The granite boulders of the foothills absorbed the solar energy during the day and radiated it back into the air at night, preventing the temperature from dropping significantly after sunset. The posse members suffered from heat exhaustion, their skin blistering where it came into contact with the metal of their firearms. They moved only during the dawn and dusk hours to conserve their internal moisture, spending the hottest parts of the day huddled under makeshift lean-tos made of sagebrush and canvas. The horses were also showing signs of severe distress from the combination of the heat and the uneven terrain. Their hooves, even when shod with steel, were chipped by the sharp edges of the volcanic rock that littered the foothills. Guard insisted on a strict grooming and watering schedule, knowing that a man on foot was no match for the Outlaws in this environment. The scent of horse sweat and leather became the dominant aroma of the camp, a pungent reminder of the animal labor required to sustain the hunt. Every animal was inspected twice daily for signs of colic or lameness, with any failing beast being immediately sent back to the Visalia stables. The landscape of the San Joaquin Valley edge was a transition zone between the fertile agricultural lands and the brutal verticality of the Sierras. It was characterized by rolling hills covered in golden, waist-high grass that could hide a man lying flat. Interspersed among these hills were clusters of massive granite outcroppings, some the size of small houses, which provided natural fortifications. The outlaws were utilizing these rocks as observation posts, allowing them to see the dust clouds generated by the posse from a distance of several miles. To counter this, Guard ordered his men to move in small groups and to avoid ridges where their silhouettes would be visible against the sky. On June 5, 1893, the trackers found a discarded tobacco tin near a dry creek bed, the brand being one that Sontag was known to favor. This physical evidence allowed Guard to narrow the search area to a 5-mile radius centered on the Stone Corral. The corral itself was a geological anomaly, a circular arrangement of massive boulders that created a natural enclosure with only 2 narrow points of entry. It offered a 360-degree field of fire and was almost impossible to approach without being seen. The outlaws had chosen this location because it maximized the effectiveness of their long-range rifles while providing cover against the posse's superior numbers. The financial scale of the operation had reached unprecedented levels, with the Southern Pacific Railroad having spent over $12,000 by the end of the first week of June. This expenditure covered the wages of the special deputies, the rental of horses, and the purchase of thousands of rounds of ammunition. The public's interest in the case was at a fever pitch, with newspapers in San Francisco and Los Angeles printing daily updates on the proximity of the law to the fugitives. This scrutiny put immense pressure on Guard to deliver a definitive result, as any further delay would be interpreted as a failure of the Marshal Service and the corporate interests they represented. The civilian support that had once protected Sontag and Evans began to evaporate under the weight of the railroad's economic sanctions. Anyone found providing food or water to the outlaws faced immediate arrest and the seizure of their property. This scorched earth policy forced the outlaws to move more frequently and to take greater risks to obtain basic necessities. They were no longer being hailed as heroes of the common man. They were being viewed as a liability that brought the unwanted attention of armed posses to the quiet homesteads of the valley. The outlaws were becoming isolated in a way that the winter snows had never managed to achieve. Guard utilized nighttime maneuvers to position his primary force without being detected by the outlaws' lookouts. The men moved in total silence, their spurs muffled with cloth and their canteens wrapped in burlap to prevent them from clinking against their belts. They navigated by the stars, following the ridgelines until they were within striking distance of the Stone Corral. The silence of the desert scrub was absolute, broken only by the occasional scuttle of a lizard or the distant cry of a coyote. This stealthy approach was designed to place the posse in a position where they could open fire at daybreak, catching the outlaws while they were still in their bedrolls. By June 8, 1893, the perimeter was almost complete. Guard had established a series of hidden outposts that overlooked every possible escape route from the Stone Corral. Each outpost was manned by 3 sharpshooters equipped with telescopic sights, a rare and expensive technology for the time. These sights allowed the deputies to identify a target at a range of 600 yards, far beyond the effective reach of a standard iron sight. The plan was not to engage in a close-quarters brawl, but to use the superior reach of their weaponry to pin the outlaws behind the rocks and wait for them to surrender or die of thirst. The physical toll on the trackers was immense, as they had to remain ahead of the main body of the posse at all times. Their eyes were perpetually strained from staring at the ground, and their hands were calloused from climbing over the sharp granite. Despite the fatigue, they remained disciplined, knowing that a single missed sign could lead the entire force into an ambush. They communicated with Guard through a series of hand signals and small rock cairns, avoiding the use of their voices. Their contribution was the foundation of the entire operation, providing the human intelligence that the railroad's money could not buy. On the afternoon of June 9, 1893, a scouting party discovered a small campfire site that was still warm to the touch. They found the remains of a ground squirrel that had been roasted over the coals and a small puddle of blood near a flat stone where Sontag had apparently rested his injured leg. This proximity sent a surge of adrenaline through the posse, the realization that the hunt was nearing its conclusion sharpening their focus. Guard ordered his men to check their weapons and to load their magazines with fresh rounds, ensuring that every firearm was in peak operating condition for the coming day. The strategy of exhaustion was beginning to pay dividends. The outlaws had been on the move for over 10 days in triple-digit heat, with minimal food and water. Their physical movements, as observed through the trackers' reports, were becoming increasingly sluggish and erratic. They were no longer checking their back trail with the same frequency, a sign of mental fatigue that often precedes a fatal error. Guard sensed the timing was right for a decisive blow. He concentrated his best marksmen at the mouth of the Stone Corral, positioning them behind the trunks of scrub oaks and in the shadows of the larger boulders. The final inventory of supplies conducted on the evening of June 10, 1893 showed that the posse was prepared for a prolonged siege. They had 5,000 rounds of rifle ammunition, 300 shotgun shells, and enough water to last for 72 hours. Guard personally inspected the firing lines, speaking to each man to ensure they understood the rules of engagement. There was to be no firing until the outlaws were clearly identified and within the effective range of the shotguns. The goal was to maximize the initial impact of the volley, creating a psychological shock that would break the outlaws' will to fight. The night of June 10th was characterized by a heavy, breathless heat that seemed to press down on the men as they lay in their hidden positions. No fires were permitted, and the only light came from the thin crescent of the moon reflecting off the gray granite of the Stone Corral. The men could hear the rhythmic chirping of crickets, a sound that masked the soft clicks of rifle bolts being cycled and the hushed whispers of the deputies. They were less than 400 yards from the outlaws, the proximity so close that they could almost sense the presence of their prey in the darkness. As the first hints of gray appeared in the eastern sky on June 11, 1893, the scale of the trap became visible. The Stone Corral sat in the center of a natural amphitheater, surrounded by higher ground that was now occupied by over 20 armed men. There was no way out that did not involve crossing several hundred yards of open, coverless ground under the barrels of the posse's rifles. The outlaws were inside the corral, unaware that the quiet of the morning was about to be shattered by the most concentrated burst of violence they had yet encountered. The hunt had transitioned from a chase to a siege, and the end was only hours away. The historical significance of this moment was not lost on Guard, who saw the impending battle as a necessary act of modernization. By removing Evans and Sontag, he was removing the last vestiges of the lawless frontier that hindered the growth of the San Joaquin Valley. The outlaws represented an old, violent way of life that could no longer coexist with the iron rails and telegraph wires of the new era. As he checked the watch in his vest pocket, Guard felt a grim satisfaction. He had used the brute force of logistics and the relentless application of technology to pin two of the most elusive men in California against a wall of stone. The final hour before the engagement was the quietest of the entire pursuit. The men in the posse sat as still as the rocks they hid behind, their fingers resting lightly on their triggers. They watched the shadows inside the Stone Corral, waiting for the first sign of movement that would signal the start of the firefight. The air was beginning to warm already, the promise of another punishing day written in the clarity of the dawn light. There was no room for error, no chance for retreat, and no further need for words. The long months of evasion and the thousands of dollars spent had led to this singular, motionless point in time. The outlaws inside the corral were beginning to stir, oblivious to the fact that they were staring into the muzzles of 25 firearms. Sontag leaned against a granite slab, his rifle within reach, while Evans began the process of preparing a meager breakfast. They were tired, wounded, and surrounded, though they did not yet know the extent of their predicament. The transition from the stillness of the morning to the roar of the ambush was imminent. The story of the Stone Corral was about to be written in the dirt with the brass of spent shells and the blood of the men who had dared to challenge the Southern Pacific Railroad. The coordinate movements of the posse had been a masterpiece of tactical discipline. Guard had succeeded in moving a large force through difficult terrain without alerting the outlaws, a feat that solidified his reputation as a master of the manhunt. Every man was in his place. Every weapon was loaded, and the geography of the Stone Corral had been turned into a lethal trap. The sun began to crest the distant peaks of the Sierras, casting long, dramatic shadows across the valley floor. The light touched the polished barrels of the Winchesters, a momentary glint that signaled the end of the peace. June 11th, 1893. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon saw the sun reach its zenith over the parched landscape of the Sierra Nevada foothills. The temperature at the base of the rock formations fluctuated between 105 and 108 degrees, creating a shimmering heat haze that distorted the visual horizon. Evans and John Sontag moved through the waist-high golden grass with a slow, mechanical gait, their bodies saturated with the salt and grit of 10 days of constant movement. They approached the southern entrance of the Stone Corral, a natural geological fortress of massive granite boulders that sat isolated in the middle of a dry plateau. Their primary objective was the small cabin located just beyond the rocks, where they intended to secure a fresh supply of water and perhaps a few hours of sleep out of the direct solar radiation. The physical structure of the Stone Corral consisted of a circular arrangement of volcanic and granite stones, some rising 10 feet into the air. These rocks were weathered and pitted, covered in a thin layer of gray lichen and fine alkaline dust that puffed up with every step the outlaws took. To a man seeking a defensive position, the site offered nearly 360 degrees of visual coverage of the surrounding plains. Evans led the way, his eyes bloodshot and narrowed against the intense glare of the sun. He gripped his .44 caliber Winchester model 1892 by the receiver, the metal so hot from the ambient temperature that it felt as though it might blister his calloused palms. John Sontag followed 20 feet behind, his movements hampered by the lingering stiffness in his wounded leg and the heavy weight of the ammunition belts draped across his shoulders. He carried a second rifle and a canvas bag containing a handful of dry biscuits and a small, nearly empty canteen. The silence of the afternoon was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the parched earth and the occasional buzz of a horsefly circling their heads. They had seen no sign of the posse since the previous evening and believed they had finally gained enough distance to allow for a temporary reprieve from the pursuit. This perceived safety was a calculated risk born of physical exhaustion and the desperate need for hydration. Unknown to the outlaws, United States Marshal George E. Guard had already positioned 20 armed men in a crescent formation around the northern and eastern faces of the Stone Corral. These deputies lay flat in the dirt, their bodies hidden by the scrub oak and the natural depressions in the terrain. They had been in position since 4 o'clock in the morning, enduring the rising heat without movement or conversation. Vic Paquette sat behind a thick-trunked oak tree, his double-barreled shotgun loaded with heavy buckshot and resting across a flat stone. The lawmen had removed their spurs and wrapped their canteens in burlap to eliminate any metallic noise that might alert the fugitives to their presence. As Evans and Sontag reached the center of the corral, they stopped near a large, flat-topped boulder that offered a small patch of shade. Evans leaned his rifle against the stone and reached for his canteen, his movements deliberate and focused on the immediate task of drinking. Sontag remained standing, his eyes scanning the ridgeline to the north with a habitual suspicion that had become his primary survival instinct. The air inside the rock circle was stagnant and smelled of dry earth and the bitter scent of sagebrush. Neither man spoke, the energy required for conversation being a luxury they could no longer afford. They were less than 50 yards from the muzzles of the hidden posse. At 1:01 in the afternoon, Marshal Guard raised his hand, signaling the deputies to prepare their weapons. The metallic clicks of 30 rifle hammers being cocked back were masked by the sudden gust of wind that swept through the canyon. The deputies adjusted their sights, aiming for the center mass of the two figures standing in the open. There was no verbal command to surrender given at this moment. The history of the Outlaws' previous encounters with the law had convinced Guard that any attempt at negotiation would only result in immediate and lethal return fire. The instruction was to wait for the signal and then unleash a concentrated volley of high-velocity projectiles. The first shot was fired by Vic Baquette at exactly 1:05. The roar of the shotgun blast shattered the silence of the plateau, the heavy buckshot tearing through the air and striking the granite boulder next to Evans. The impact sent a spray of stone shards and copper fragments into the side of Evans' face, the suddenness of the attack causing him to dive toward the base of the rocks. Almost simultaneously, the rest of the posse opened fire, the combined report of 20 rifles sounding like a single massive explosion. The air was instantly filled with the white, acrid smoke of black powder, obscuring the vision of both the attackers and the defenders. John Sontag was hit in the first 5 seconds of the engagement. A high-caliber rifle bullet struck him in the right shoulder, the force of the projectile spinning him around and knocking him to the ground. He rolled behind a jagged stone, his hand already reaching for the lever of his Winchester. Despite the shock and the searing pain in his upper body, Sontag managed to cycle around into the chamber and fire back toward the direction of the smoke. His shot was aimed at the flash of a rifle barrel he saw near a scrub oak, the bullet striking the wood and sending a shower of bark into the air. Chris Evans had managed to recover his rifle and was now pressed tightly against the base of a 7-foot granite slab. He felt the sting of blood running down his cheek from the initial stone splinters, but he did not stop to wipe it away. He fired 3 rapid shots toward the ridgeline, the brass casings ejecting from his Winchester and bouncing off the rocks with a sharp metallic ring. He could see the silhouettes of the deputies shifting among the trees, their movements coordinated and relentless. The volume of fire coming from the posse was overwhelming, with dozens of bullets striking the rocks around him every minute, creating a constant percussion of impact. The technical advantage of the posse was immediately evident in the density of their fire. They were using a mix of Winchester rifles and specialized long-range Sharps carbines that could penetrate the thinner edges of the granite boulders. The Outlaws were trapped in a space approximately 40 feet in diameter, with no way to exit without exposing themselves to a crossfire from 3 different directions. The ground around them was being chewed up by the constant stream of metal, the dry grass igniting in small patches from the heat of the passing projectiles. The smell of burnt powder and ozone became the dominant sensory experience for the men trapped inside the corral. By 1:15, the firefight had reached a sustained level of brutality. Sontag had been hit a second time, this time a flesh wound to the side of his neck that sent a stream of crimson down his shirt. He was lying flat on his stomach, using a narrow gap between 2 stones to return fire. His breathing was rapid and shallow, the heat and the blood loss beginning to affect his peripheral vision. He shouted to Evans, his voice barely audible over the roar of the guns, asking for more ammunition. Evans slid a box of .44 caliber rounds across the dirt, the cardboard tearing as it hit the sharp edges of the stones. The deputies continued to close the distance, moving in small groups of 3 while the rest of the posse provided covering fire. They used the brute force of their numbers to keep the outlaws pinned down, ensuring that neither Evans nor Sontag could lift their heads long enough to aim accurately. Marshal Guard directed the movement from a central position using hand signals to coordinate the flanking maneuvers. He wanted to squeeze the outlaws into the smallest possible area before ordering a final charge. The strategy was one of total suppression, intended to break the outlaws' physical and mental capacity to resist. A third bullet caught John Sontag in the hip as he attempted to shift his position to get a better angle on a deputy named Henderson. The projectile shattered the bone, the impact causing Sontag to cry out and collapse into a heap. He was now unable to move his lower body, his mobility reduced to a desperate crawl through the dirt. Blood was pooling beneath him, turning the gray dust into a dark, viscous mud. Despite the severity of his injuries, he continued to reload his rifle, his movements stiff and jerky as his body began to go into shock. He was determined to keep firing until his ammunition was exhausted. Chris Evans realized the gravity of their situation as he watched Sontag struggle. He shifted his aim toward Vic Paquette's position, firing a series of shots that forced the deputy to duck behind the oak tree. Evans was a superior marksman, and his presence alone kept the posse from simply rushing the corral. Every time a deputy showed himself, Evans would place a bullet within inches of the man's head, the high-pitched whine of the passing metal serving as a lethal deterrent. He was fighting with a cold, calculated ferocity, his mind focused entirely on the mechanics of the Winchester and the movement of the men in the brush. The environment of the Stone Corral became a landscape of flying debris and heat. The granite rocks, once a source of shelter, were now becoming a hazard as they chipped and splintered under the impact of the posse's ammunition. Large fragments of stone were being knocked loose, falling onto the outlaws and adding to their physical trauma. The temperature inside the corral seemed to rise even further, the heat of the guns and the lack of air movement making the atmosphere nearly unbearable. Evans felt his mouth become bone-dry, his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth as he swallowed the dust kicked up by the bullets. By 1:30 the posse had fired over 500 rounds into the small rock enclosure. The scale of the assault was unprecedented for a regional manhunt, reflecting the railroad's demand for a definitive conclusion. The sound of the gunfire was a continuous rolling thunder that could be heard in the town of Visalia miles away. The deputies were cycling through their ammunition rapidly, with some men pausing only to let their rifle barrels cool in the shade of the oaks. The sheer relentless nature of the attack left the outlaws with no time to plan a retreat, or even to properly tend to their wounds. A heavy projectile from a Sharp's rifle struck the top of the boulder Evans was using for cover, shearing off a 10-pound chunk of granite that fell directly onto Evans' left hand. He felt the bones in 2 of his fingers snap under the weight, a sickening crunch that he felt more than he heard. He gasped, dropping his rifle into the dirt as a wave of nausea washed over him. He used his right hand to shove the stone aside, his fingers already beginning to swell and turn a deep purple. He forced himself to pick up the Winchester again, gripping it with his remaining good fingers and leaning it against the rock for support. Sontag was now drifting in and out of consciousness, his blood loss reaching a critical level. He had been hit again in the arm, a glancing blow that had torn a long strip of muscle from his forearm. He lay in a hollow between 2 boulders, his eyes fixed on the blue sky above the corral. He could see the buzzards beginning to circle high overhead, their shadows passing over the rocks in slow rhythmic circles. He managed to fire one more shot, the recoil of the rifle sending a jolt of pain through his shattered hip that made him black out for several seconds. When he came to, the world was a blur of smoke and the sound of distant shouting. The deputies, sensing that the resistance from the corral was weakening, began to move even closer. They were now within 30 yards of the outer rocks, their shotguns loaded and ready for the final assault. Vic Paquette shouted a command for the outlaws to throw down their weapons, his voice cutting through the momentary lull in the firing. Evans responded by firing a single shot that struck the brim of Paquette's hat, a defiant act that signaled his refusal to surrender. The exchange of fire resumed with even greater intensity, the posse determined to end the stalemate through sheer volume of ammunition. The physical reality of the Stone Corral was now one of total carnage. The interior of the circle was littered with hundreds of spent brass casings, shredded clothing, and the dark stains of human blood. The smell was a nauseating mix of burnt powder, copper, and the rank scent of sweat. The outlaws were no longer the hunters, they were trapped animals fighting for their lives in a box made of stone and lead. The historical context of the West was being written in this small patch of dirt, the transition from the lawless frontier to the ordered state being finalized through the application of superior firepower and organized force. Marshal Guard checked his watch at 1:45. He realized that while the outlaws were severely wounded, they still possessed enough ammunition to make a direct charge extremely costly in terms of deputy lives. He decided to continue the siege from a distance, using his marksmen to pick away at the outlaws' cover until they were forced to move. He ordered his men to aim for the gaps between the rocks, hoping to catch Evans or Sontag in a crossfire. The psychological pressure of the weight was intended to be as effective as the bullets themselves, wearing down the survivors' remaining resolve. Inside the corral, Chris Evans was reaching the limit of his physical endurance. His vision was beginning to tunnel, and the pain from his crushed fingers was a constant throbbing distraction. He looked at Sontag and realized his partner was likely dying. The younger man's face was the color of wood ash, and his breathing was a wet, rattling sound that indicated a chest wound. Evans knew that their time was measured in minutes rather than hours. He began to gather the remaining ammunition, sliding it into his pockets and checking the magazine of his Winchester. He was preparing for a final stand, a literal interpretation of the outlaw code. The sun continued to bake the plateau, the heat intensifying the smell of the blood and the gunpowder. The grass around the corral had mostly burned away, leaving a blackened ring of earth that made the outlaws' position even more prominent. The deputies were now so close that Evans could hear the sound of their heavy breathing and the rustle of their clothes as they shifted in the brush. He felt a strange sense of clarity in the midst of the violence, a sharpening of his senses that allowed him to focus on the individual blades of grass and the movement of the heat waves. He was no longer afraid. He was simply a part of the landscape and the conflict. A volley of shotgun fire from the eastern ridge struck the rock directly above Sontag's head, showering him in more granite fragments. One of the heavy pellets caught him in the shoulder, adding to the list of injuries that his body could no longer process. He did not cry out this time. He merely blinked and adjusted his grip on the rifle barrel. His world had narrowed to the small patch of dirt in front of his face and the sound of the metal hitting the stone. He was a prisoner of his own body and the geography of the Stone Corral, a man who had run out of road and out of time. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the firing from the posse stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was heavy and expectant, the only sound being the distant whistle of a train on the Southern Pacific tracks far to the west. Marshal Guard stood up from his position, his rifle held at the ready, and looked toward the corral. He could see the smoke clearing and the motionless forms of the outlaws behind the rocks. He did not order a charge yet, waiting to see if Evans would attempt one last desperate move. The first act of the Battle of the Stone Corral had concluded, leaving the participants on the brink of total annihilation. The brutality of the initial 45 minutes of the fight had set a new standard for violence in the state of California. Over 600 rounds had been exchanged, multiple injuries had been sustained, and the landscape had been permanently scarred by the exchange of metal. The scale of the fight was a testament to the relentlessness of the pursuit and the desperation of the fugitives. As the two sides sat in the heat and the silence, the historical weight of the event began to settle. The Stone Corral was no longer just a geological feature. It was a site of massive human conflict, a physical manifestation of the struggle for control over the American West. The outlaws remained behind their wall of stone, their blood seeping into the California dirt, while the Marshals waited in the shadows of the oaks. The technology of the era, from the repeating rifles to the high-velocity ammunition, had turned a simple arrest attempt into a siege of industrial proportions. The next phase of the battle would be determined by who could endure the heat and the thirst the longest. Evans looked at his mangled hand, and then at the barrel of his Winchester, preparing himself for the arrival of the Marshals that he knew would come with the next surge of the sun. The arrival at the Stone Corral had transformed from a hope for refuge into a certain path toward a violent end. June 11, 1893, at precisely 2:15 in the afternoon, saw the transition of the engagement from a chaotic ambush into a systematic siege of attrition. The air above the Stone Corral shimmered with a dense thermal distortion, the mercury hovering at 109 degrees. Chris Evans shifted his weight behind a 3-ton granite slab, his boots sliding through a thick layer of spent brass casings that had accumulated during the previous hour. His left hand, with 2 fingers shattered by a falling rock fragment, throbbed with a rhythmic intensity that matched the percussion of the ongoing rifle fire. He used his teeth to tighten a strip of denim around the mangled digits, the copper taste of his own blood mixing with the alkaline dust that coated his tongue. Every movement was a struggle against the physical resistance of the heat, which seemed to thicken the atmosphere until it possessed a tangible, heavy weight. John Sontag lay precisely 4 feet to the left of Evans, his body wedged into a natural crevice between 2 upright boulders. The hip wound he had sustained at 1:30 in the afternoon had bled through his trousers, creating a dark, sticky patch that had already begun to dry in the searing sun. He held his Winchester Model 1892 by the forestock, his fingers trembling from the onset of hypovolemic shock. He watched the ridgeline to the northeast where the glint of a polished rifle barrel indicated the position of a deputy. Sontag did not fire. He understood that their remaining .44 caliber ammunition was a finite resource that dictated the duration of their lives. He waited until a silhouette moved against the scrub oak before squeezing the trigger, the recoil of the rifle jarring his wounded shoulder and forcing a sharp intake of breath through his gritted teeth. The posse, under the direct supervision of Marshal George E. Guard, had established 4 distinct firing points that effectively boxed the outlaws into a 40-foot kill zone. These men utilized the brute force of high-velocity ammunition to slowly disintegrate the protective edges of the granite boulders. A copper-jacketed slug from a Sharps rifle struck the top of Evans' cover at 2:32 in the afternoon, the impact generating a shower of razor-sharp stone shards that peppered the outlaw's neck. The physics of the engagement were relentless. The granite was not an invincible shield, but a deteriorating barrier that lost mass with every incoming volley. Evans could hear the high-pitched whine of the projectiles as they ricocheted off the stones, the sound like the scream of a circular saw cutting through dry timber. Vic Beckett moved his position 40 yards to the west at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, seeking a lateral angle that would allow him to see behind the primary rock where the outlaws crouched. He crawled through the parched grass, his heavy shotgun cradled in his arms, the metal of the barrels reaching a temperature that made the walnut stalk smell of toasted wood. He reached a cluster of manzanita bushes and waited for a lull in the wind. The silence of the afternoon was deceptive, a brief pause that allowed the sound of Sontag's labored, wet breathing to reach the ears of the deputies. Beckett signaled to the men on the ridge to increase the volume of fire, creating a wall of noise that would mask his final approach to the edge of the corral. The outlaw's primary disadvantage was the lack of water, a physiological crisis that began to manifest in blurred vision and a loss of fine motor control by 3:30 in the afternoon. Evans tried to swallow, but his throat was so constricted by thirst that the action caused him to gag. He looked at the canteen lying in the dirt 10 feet away, its side punctured by a stray bullet and its contents long since evaporated into the thirsty soil. He realized that the Marshals were using the environment as a weapon, waiting for the biological reality of dehydration to do the work that their guns had yet to finish. The sun was a physical antagonist, a glowing white orb that seemed to press down on the corral with the intent to crush the life from the men hiding within the rocks. Inside the corral, the mechanical reliability of the firearms began to fail due to the accumulation of carbon fouling and the extreme ambient heat. Evans found that the lever of his Winchester was becoming difficult to cycle, the metal expanding and the internal grease thickening with the grit of the valley. He was forced to use the heel of his good hand to slam the lever forward, each motion a deliberate and painful exertion. The brass casings being ejected were hot enough to burn his skin upon contact, adding a series of small, blistered welts to his forearms. He spent 3 minutes using a pocket knife to scrape the buildup from the bolt face, his eyes never leaving the ridgeline where the posse lurked in the shadows of the oaks. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the volume of fire from the posse had surpassed 1,000 rounds. The impact of so much metal had transformed the appearance of the Stone Corral, the gray granite now white and scarred by the thousands of individual strikes. The ground was littered with the remnants of the copper-jacketed slugs, their deformed shapes resembling small jagged flowers made of hardened metal. Marshal Guard ordered a temporary ceasefire to allow the smoke to clear and to evaluate the condition of the outlaws. He shouted a final demand for surrender, his voice amplified by the natural acoustics of the rock basin. The only response was a single defiant shot from Sontag that struck the dirt 2 feet in front of Guard's boots, the bullet kicking up a plume of dust that hung in the stagnant air. John Sontag's physical state took a drastic turn for the worse at 4:15 in the afternoon when a high-caliber projectile from the ridge caught him in the side of the chest. The bullet passed through the intercostal muscles and lodged against a rib, the force of the impact knocking him backward against the stone wall. He felt a hot, bubbling sensation in his chest and tasted the metallic tang of blood in the back of his throat. He looked down at the entry wound, a small, dark hole that pulsed with every heartbeat. He knew the injury was fatal, but the adrenaline and the sheer stubbornness of his character kept him from dropping his weapon. He gripped the Winchester with a predatory intensity, his eyes fixed on the gap in the rocks through which the Marshals would eventually come. Chris Evans witnessed Sontag's latest injury and moved across the open dirt of the corral to reach his partner's side. He moved at precisely 4:20 in the afternoon, drawing a frantic volley of fire from the deputies who had been waiting for such a target. 3 bullets struck the dirt between his feet, and a 4th tore through the sleeve of his coat, grazing the skin of his upper arm. He dove into the crevice with Sontag, his breathing heavy and ragged. He looked at the younger man's face and saw the gray pallor of impending death. Evans didn't offer words of comfort. He simply checked the magazine of Sontag's rifle and placed it back in the man's hands, ensuring that the hammer was cocked and ready. The posse's tactics shifted at 4:45 in the afternoon as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. The changing light created long, deceptive shadows that obscured the movements of the men in the brush. Deputy Henderson utilized this cover to move within 25 yards of the southern entrance, carrying a bag of dynamite he had retrieved from the supply wagon. The plan was to use the explosives to shatter the outer wall of the corral, depriving the outlaws of their masonry protection. Henderson moved with a lethal patience, sliding from one oak tree to the next. His eyes locked on the silhouette of Evans, he reached a position behind a large quartz outcropping and began the process of fusing the sticks. His hands steady despite the proximity to the Outlaws' rifles. The air inside the rock circle grew even more oppressive as the day progressed, the smell of the blood and the burnt powder trapped within the stone walls. Evans felt a sense of detachment from his own body, the pain from his hand and arm receding into a dull, constant ache. He focused on the mechanics of the fight, the weight of the rifle, the alignment of the sights, and the pressure on the trigger. He was a machine of survival, stripped of emotion and focused entirely on the destruction of the men who sought his life. He watched the movement of a manzanita branch 50 yards away and fired a 3-shot burst that shredded the leaves and forced the hidden deputy to retreat. At 5 o'clock in the evening, the temperature dropped to 98 degrees, but the rocks continued to radiate the heat they had absorbed throughout the day. The ground inside the corral was so hot that it felt like standing on a stovetop, the heat rising through the thin leather soles of the Outlaws' boots. Sontag had lost consciousness twice in the last 30 minutes, his body struggling to maintain its vital functions as the internal bleeding continued. Each time he woke, he reached for his rifle, his movements a testament to the brute force of his will. He was a dying man, but he remained a combatant, a fact that the Marshals acknowledged by refusing to move into the open. The technological disparity between the two sides was highlighted by the Posse's use of a field telescope to monitor the Outlaws' movements. From a distance of 300 yards, Marshal Guard could see the specific details of Sontag's injuries and the frustration on Evans' face. This information allowed him to direct the fire with surgical precision, targeting the specific rocks that the Outlaws relied on for cover. He knew that Evans was the primary threat and ordered his best marksmen to focus their fire on the man's position whenever he attempted to reload. The siege was a cold, calculated application of superior resources against two men who had nothing left but their weapons and their resolve. A massive explosion rocked the southern end of the Stone Corral at 5:15 in the evening as Henderson successfully detonated the first charge of dynamite. The blast sent a column of black smoke and pulverized granite into the air, the shockwave knocking Evans to the ground and temporarily deafening both Outlaws. When the dust settled, a 4-foot section of the stone wall had been reduced to rubble, creating a breach that the deputies could now exploit. Evans scrambled to his feet, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. He saw the movement of the posse through the hole in the wall and unleashed a rapid-fire volley that drove the deputies back into the brush. The brutality of the situation was compounded by the arrival of thousands of small, biting gnats attracted to the scent of the blood and the sweat. These insects swarmed over the Outlaws, crawling into their eyes and open wounds, adding a layer of physical misery to the already dire circumstances. Evans tried to brush them away with his mangled hand, but the motion only caused more pain. He stayed low to the ground, the heat and the insects making every second an exercise in endurance. He looked at Sontag, whose face was covered in the black insects, and felt a surge of cold fury toward the men on the ridge who were watching through their telescopes. The exchange of fire continued at a steady pace through the late afternoon, the sound of the Winchesters echoing through the canyon like a hammer on an anvil. The Outlaws were now firing from a prone position, their bodies pressed into the dirt to minimize their profile. They were using the rubble from the dynamite blast as a secondary barrier, the jagged stones providing new angles for defense. Despite the damage to the corral, the natural masonry of the site remained a formidable obstacle. The Marshals found that every inch of ground gained was paid for with a high risk of being hit by Evans' return fire. By 5:45 in the evening, the Outlaws had expended 3/4 of their ammunition. Evans counted the remaining .44 caliber rounds, realizing they had fewer than 50 bullets left between them. He divided the ammunition equally, sliding 25 rounds into Sontag's pocket and keeping the rest for himself. This logistical reality signaled the beginning of the final phase of the battle. They could no longer afford to suppress the deputies. They had to make every shot a lethal hit. The silence between the shots grew longer as the outlaws waited for the deputies to expose themselves, the tension in the air reaching a breaking point. Marshal Guard noticed the decrease in the outlaws' fire and correctly interpreted it as a shortage of ammunition. He ordered his men to tighten the circle, moving the perimeter to within 50 yards of the corral. The deputies moved in a crawling formation, their bellies against the hot earth, their rifles held high to keep the actions free of dirt. They were like a slow-moving tide of blue wool and steel, gradually erasing the distance between themselves and the fugitives. The physical scale of the hunt was now visible to the naked eye. The sheer number of armed men making the outlaws' position look precarious and isolated. The injuries sustained by the outlaws were not limited to the bullet wounds. The concussive force of the hundreds of rounds hitting the stones had caused internal trauma, leaving both men with severe headaches and a sense of disorientation. Evans felt as though his brain were rattling within his skull, the constant vibration of the impact making it difficult to maintain a steady aim. His eyes were bloodshot and swollen from the dust and the lack of sleep, making the distant ridgeline appear as a flickering, indistinct line. He relied on instinct and muscle memory to cycle the rifle, his body operating on a level of primitive survival that bypassed conscious thought. The historical context of the Stone Corral was one of a landscape that had seen centuries of conflict, but nothing that matched the industrial intensity of this afternoon. The sheer volume of fire and the use of explosives represented a new era of law enforcement in the West, where the brute force of the state was used to crush individual resistance. The outlaws were a remnant of an earlier, more chaotic time, their skills with a rifle no longer sufficient to overcome the organized power of the railroad and the Marshals. They were being hammered into the dirt by a system that had no room for their brand of defiance. At 6 o'clock in the evening, a second stick of dynamite was thrown into the center of the corral, landing 5 feet from where Sontag lay. The explosion was smaller than the first, but still powerful, enough to lift Sontag's body off the ground and toss him like a rag doll into a pile of stones. He landed with a sickening thud, his remaining strength finally failing him. He did not move, his eyes staring blankly at the darkening sky. Evans crawled to him, checking for a pulse and finding it weak and erratic. He knew that Sontag would not survive the night, a realization that solidified his own decision to fight to the very end. The sun touched the edge of the mountains at 6:15 in the evening, casting a deep orange light over the scene. The shadows of the boulders stretched across the corral like long, dark fingers, providing the outlaws with a temporary visual advantage. Evans utilized this change in light to move to a new position near the northern breach, his Winchester held at hip level. He saw a deputy named Hall attempting to dash across a gap in the brush and fired a single shot that caught the man in the thigh. Hall collapsed with a scream, the sound echoing through the stillness and momentarily halting the posse's advance. The mechanical process of the fight had now become a matter of seconds and individual actions. Evans reloaded his rifle for what he knew would be the last time, the click of the cartridges entering the magazine tube the only sound in his immediate world. He felt a strange sense of calm, the fear having been burned away by the heat and the violence of the afternoon. He was a part of the stone, a part of the dirt, and a part of the history of this place. He waited for the next movement from the brush, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, his mind a void of white noise and grit. The deputies were also feeling the weight of the day, their movements becoming slower as the adrenaline began to fade. They were tired, hungry, and frustrated by the continued resistance of 2 men they had expected to capture hours ago. The brutality of the firefight had taken a toll on their nerves, the constant threat of a high-caliber bullet, making every step an act of courage. They watched the shadows inside the corral, knowing that a wounded Chris Evans was still a lethal adversary. The stalemate continued as the light faded, the two sides locked in a lethal embrace that only death or total darkness could break. As the second hour of the sustained firefight concluded, the Stone Corral was a place of total devastation. The rocks were shattered, the ground was soaked in blood, and the air was thick with the scent of death and gunpowder. The outlaws were broken physically, but their spirit of resistance remained intact, a testament to the sheer brute force of their will. The Marshals stood on the threshold of victory, but the cost had already been high, and the final bill had yet to be paid. The battle for the Stone Corral was entering its final, most intimate stage, where the distance between the hunter and the hunted would be measured in feet rather than yards. The historical weight of 1893 was heavy on the shoulders of William Guard as he watched the sun set. He knew that the news of this fight would be telegraphed across the country, a signal that the era of the outlaw was ending. The Stone Corral would become a landmark of this transition, a site where the old ways died under the weight of organized law and industrial might. He checked his watch one last time and ordered his men to hold their positions through the night. He would not risk another man's life in the dark. He would wait for the dawn to finish what the afternoon had started. Chris Evans sat in the cooling dirt, his back against the granite, and watched the first stars appear over the Sierras. He could hear the low moans of Sontag and the distant rustle of the Posse. He was alone in a way he had never been before, a man who had outlived his time and his partner. He reached into his pocket and found a single crumpled cigarette, lighting it with a steady hand. The smoke was a small comfort in the midst of the carnage, a brief moment of humanity before the final storming of the corral. The mechanics of the fire were over for the day, but the reality of the wounds and the history they made would remain forever in the stones of the Sierra Nevada. 7 o'clock in the evening on June 11th, 1893 brought no relief from the thermal energy trapped within the granite walls of the Stone Corral. The sun hung low over the western ridges, casting a harsh horizontal light that illuminated the thick clouds of alkaline dust hanging in the stagnant air. Chris Evans sat with his back pressed against a jagged slab of rock, his breathing coming in heavy rhythmic rasps. A single pellet from a deputy's shotgun blast had earlier struck him directly in the left eye, destroying the globe and lodging deep within the orbital socket. Blood and vitreous fluid leaked down his cheek, mixing with the gray dust to form a dark, thick crust that obscured half of his face. He did not have the medical supplies to dress the wound, so he simply leaned his head back, allowing the fluid to drain while he kept his remaining eye fixed on the northern breach of the rocks. The physical condition of John Sontag was significantly worse, characterized by a slow and visible decline in his autonomic functions. He lay in a shallow depression in the earth, his body punctured by 7 distinct bullet wounds ranging from his shoulder to his hip. The chest wound he had received in the late afternoon had begun to produce a wet, bubbling sound with every inhalation, indicating that a projectile had damaged the pleural cavity. His skin had taken on a sallow, translucent quality, and his hands were stained a deep crimson from his repeated attempts to stem the flow of blood from his shattered hip. He was no longer able to hold his Winchester upright, instead resting the barrel on a small stone and keeping his finger hooked around the trigger guard through sheer muscular contraction. The environment inside the corral was a literal study in the mechanics of a high-intensity siege. The ground was no longer composed of simple dirt and dry grass. It was a composite layer of pulverized granite, shredded clothing, and thousands of deformed, copper-jacketed projectiles. The smell was a pervasive metallic stench of fresh blood and burnt potassium nitrate that clung to the back of the throat. Every time a stray bullet from the posse struck the rock walls, it generated a localized burst of heat and a spray of stone fragments that further irritated the outlaws' open wounds. There was no water left in the enclosure, and the physiological effects of dehydration were manifesting as severe muscle tremors and a swollen, blackened tongue for both men. Marshal George E. Guard maintained a strict perimeter as the light began to fail, positioning his men in a way that maximized their visibility of the corral's exits. The deputies were exhausted but remained disciplined, their eyes straining against the glare of the setting sun. Vic Paquette sat behind a thick oak trunk, his thumb resting on the hammer of his shotgun, watching the shadows inside the rocks for any sign of a desperate breakout. The lawmen understood that the outlaws were trapped in a biological countdown, their lives being measured by the remaining volume of their blood and the duration of the twilight. The marshals had the luxury of rotating their men to a nearby spring for water, a tactical advantage that intensified the brutality of the situation for the fugitives. The loss of his eye had significantly altered Chris Evans' depth perception, forcing him to tilt his head at an awkward angle to align the iron sights of his Winchester. He found that the neurological shock of the injury was causing a persistent throbbing pain that radiated through his skull, yet he remained focused on the movement of the brush. He saw a flash of blue wool 50 yards to the east and fired a single calculated shot. The bullet struck a granite boulder near the deputy, sending a shower of sparks into the air and forcing the man to retreat into a deeper gully. Evans was not firing for volume anymore. He was firing to maintain a lethal presence, proving to the posse that he was still capable of killing anyone who ventured into the open. John Sontag's consciousness flickered like a dying candle in the evening wind. He began to experience auditory hallucinations, the sound of the crickets in the grass transforming into the rhythmic clicking of a telegraph key. He reached out with his good hand and gripped Evans' boot, a silent gesture of recognition in the midst of the carnage. Evans looked down at his partner and saw the vacancy in the younger man's eyes, a sign that the brain was no longer receiving adequate oxygen. Despite this, Sontag managed to mutter a request for more ammunition, his voice a dry, rattling whisper that barely carried over the sound of the evening breeze. Evans reached into his pocket and placed 3 rounds of .44 caliber ammunition next to Sontag's hand, though both men knew the younger outlaw would likely never use them. The technology of the fight continued to favor the posse as they utilized the darkening horizon to move closer to the stone walls. They used small hand mirrors to signal between the different firing positions, avoiding the use of vocal commands that would reveal their exact locations. The marshals also began to utilize a rhythmic firing pattern, where one group would fire a volley every 10 minutes to keep the outlaws from resting or attempting to dress their wounds. This constant auditory pressure was designed to break the outlaws' mental resolve, a psychological tactic that complemented the physical destruction of the granite enclosure. The sound of the bullets hitting the stone was a constant percussive reminder of the inevitability of the marshals' arrival. By 7:45 in the evening, the temperature had dropped to 95 degrees, but the rocks remained hot to the touch, radiating the accumulated solar energy of the day. Evans felt as though he were being cooked between the stones and the internal fever caused by his infected wounds. He used the sleeve of his shirt to wipe the gore from his good eye, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid attracting the attention of the sharpshooters on the ridge. He was an island of resistance in a landscape of total hostility, a man whose world had shrunk to the length of a rifle barrel and the diameter of a rock circle. The historical reality of the Old West was being stripped of its myths and reduced to this gritty, literal struggle for a few more minutes of existence. The mechanical failure of the outlaws' equipment became a critical factor as the grit from the day's firefight jammed the internal springs of the Winchester rifles. Evans found that the loading gate of his weapon was stuck, requiring him to use a small pebble to force the cartridges into the magazine. His fingers, already mangled and swollen, bled onto the brass casings, making them slick and difficult to handle. This struggle with the hardware of the fight was a testament to the sheer brute force of the environment, where the very tools of survival were being reclaimed by the dust and the heat. He worked with a grim patience, his mind operating on a level of primitive instinct that ignored the pain and the loss of his eye. A deputy named Smith attempted to crawl toward the southern breach at 8 o'clock in the evening, carrying a lantern he intended to use to illuminate the interior of the corral once total darkness fell. Evans saw the movement and waited until the man was within 40 yards before firing. The bullet struck the lantern, shattering the glass and igniting the kerosene in a brief, brilliant flash of orange flame. Smith scrambled backward, his hands scorched by the burning oil, while the posse unleashed a furious retaliatory volley that chipped away more of the rock where Evans hid. This brief exchange highlighted the relentless nature of the siege, where every attempt at an advantage was met with immediate and lethal counterforce. The physical reality of Sontag's condition reached a point of near stasis by 8:15. He had stopped bleeding heavily only because his blood pressure had dropped too low to maintain the flow. His breathing was now a series of shallow, jagged gasps that rattled in his throat, a sound that Evans found more unsettling than the roar of the rifles. Sontag's eyes were fixed on the first stars appearing in the sky, his mind likely detached from the sensory horror of the Stone Corral. He was a body composed of holes and trauma, held together only by the cooling dirt and the remnants of his clothing. He represented the total physical cost of the railroad's bounty and the Marshals' determination. The scale of the ammunition expended was evidenced by the thick layer of copper and lead-free metal fragments that covered the entrance of the corral. The Marshals had fired an estimated 1,500 rounds since the arrival at 1 o'clock, a volume of fire that had physically altered the height and shape of several boulders. This was not a skirmish. It was a localized war of annihilation conducted with the industrial efficiency of the late 19th century. The Marshals were not merely trying to arrest the men, they were attempting to erase them through the sheer application of superior firepower. Every minute that Evans and Sontag remained alive was an anomaly in the face of such overwhelming odds. Inside the corral, the darkness began to pool in the crevices of the rocks, providing the outlaws with a temporary and fragile sense of security. Evans moved from his primary position to a smaller rock closer to Sontag, his movements a series of agonizing crawls that left a trail of blood in the dirt. He sat next to his partner, the two men forming a small, broken unit in the center of the devastation. Evans looked at Sontag's face in the fading light and saw that the younger man's jaw had gone slack. He reached out and closed Sontag's eyes, believing for a moment that the end had finally come. But a sudden wet cough proved that the younger outlaw was still clinging to a sliver of life. The posse's resolve was bolstered by the arrival of a supply wagon from Visalia at 8:30 in the evening, bringing more ammunition and several gallons of fresh water. The sound of the wagon's wheels and the neighing of the horses reached the outlaws, a cruel reminder of the resources the law had at its disposal. The deputies sat in the tall grass eating dry rations and drinking their fill, while the scent of the water drifted toward the corral on the evening breeze. This disparity in resources was the defining characteristic of the battle, a conflict where the outlaws were being starved and bled out by an organization with a limitless reach. Chris Evans began to experience the first signs of wound fever as the night progressed, his body shaking with a chill that contradicted the heat of the rocks. He gripped the stock of his Winchester so hard that his mangled fingers began to throb with a new intensity. He realized that the morning would bring the final storming of the corral and that he had only 12 rounds of ammunition left. He began to organize these rounds on a flat stone, placing them in rows of 3 so he could find them in the dark. He was preparing his final account, a literal tally of the lives he intended to take before his own ended in the dirt of the Sierra Nevada. The dust in the air began to settle as the wind died down, revealing the full extent of the damage to the Stone Corral. The granite was bone white where the bullets had stripped away the lichen, and the ground was blackened by the small fires ignited by the muzzle flashes. The scene was one of ancient masonry meeting modern ballistics, a collision that had left the Outlaws as the only biological remnants in a landscape of stone and metal. Evans felt a strange sense of ownership over the site, as though his blood had permanently bonded him to the geology of the plateau. He was no longer a fugitive. He was a part of the Stone Corral, a permanent fixture in the history of the San Joaquin. Marshal Guard ordered his men to cease all conversation at 9 o'clock, creating a wall of silence around the Outlaws that was as oppressive as the gunfire. The only sounds were the natural noises of the night, the scuttle of a lizard, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional clink of a deputy's rifle against a stone. This silence was a tactical tool intended to heighten the Outlaws' paranoia and force them to expend their mental energy on every shadow. Guard knew that Evans was a hunter by trade and that the man would be listening for the sound of a creeping boot or a snapped twig. By maintaining total silence, the Marshals denied Evans the information he needed to defend himself. The injury to Evans' eye had begun to swell shut completely, the surrounding tissue turning a deep, bruised purple that stood out against the pallor of his skin. He found that he had to use his fingers to pry the eyelid open every few minutes to maintain his field of vision. The pain was a constant, sharp needle in his brain, but he refused to let it distract him from the perimeter. He was a man of immense physical resilience, a quality that had allowed him to survive years of hard labor and previous gunfights. This resilience was now being tested to its absolute limit, a brute force of character that matched the relentlessness of the Posse. John Sontag's pulse had become so weak that Evans could no longer feel it in the man's wrist. He leaned in close to Sontag's chest and heard the slow, labored thumping of a heart that was running out of fuel. The younger man's body was cold to the touch despite the ambient heat, a sign that the end was minutes or hours away. Evans felt a momentary surge of grief, not for the crimes they had committed, but for the shared suffering in the rocks. They were 2 men who had challenged a system and had been broken by the mechanics of that system's response. The evening was a long, slow transition into the finality of the coming day. The historical context of the battle was rooted in the transition of the West from a land of individual action to a land of corporate and state control. The Stone Corral was the final battlefield of this transition, where the Outlaws represented the chaotic past and the Marshals represented the ordered future. As Evans sat in the dark, he was aware that his actions would be scrutinized by the newspapers and the courts. But those thoughts were secondary to the immediate reality of his missing eye and his dying partner. The grit and the brutality were the only truths he had left, the literal sensations of his own body and the cold steel of his rifle. By 9:30 in the evening, the moon rose over the Sierras, casting a pale silver light over the plateau. The Stone Corral looked like a ruined castle in the moonlight, its shattered walls and debris-strewn interior taking on a haunting skeletal appearance. Evans watched the play of light on the rocks, looking for the movement of the deputies' silhouettes. He saw nothing, the lawmen having learned to stay below the ridgeline to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. The silence continued, a heavy, expectant void that seemed to pull at the remaining strength in Evans' limbs. He leaned his head against the stone and closed his good eye for a few seconds, fighting the urge to drift into a sleep, from which he knew he might not wake. The mechanical process of Sontag's death was a slow erosion of his biological systems. First, the kidneys failed due to the lack of blood pressure, then the liver, and finally the cognitive centers of the brain. He was no longer John Sontag. He was a collection of failing organs and traumatic injuries, a physical manifestation of the cost of defiance. Evans watched this process with a clinical detachment, his own injuries having numbed his capacity for emotional response. He was a survivor watching a casualty, a man who still had a magazine of ammunition and a purpose, however futile it might be. The evening was a corridor leading toward the ultimate conclusion of the fight. As the hour approached 10 o'clock, the wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of dry sage and the distant smell of wood smoke from the deputy's camp. Evans inhaled deeply, the smell a brief reminder of a world outside the rock circle. He reached for his Winchester and checked the action one last time, the metal smooth and cold against his skin. He was ready for whatever the night or the morning brought, a man whose resolve had been forged in the heat and the blood of the Stone Corral. He looked out over the silver landscape, his remaining eyes scanning for the flash of a badge or the glint of a barrel, a sentinel in a kingdom of stone and dust. The brutality of the situation was absolute, leaving no room for the romanticism often associated with the American frontier. It was a matter of blood in the dirt, the smell of decaying tissue and the unrelenting pressure of a superior force. The scale of the fight, from the thousands of rounds fired to the horrific injuries sustained, solidified the Battle of the Stone Corral as one of the most violent encounters in the history of California. As the evening drew to a close, the outlaws remained behind their wall, a testament to the sheer brute force of their will to survive against the inevitable arrival of the Marshals. Chris Evans adjusted his position, his mangled hand sparking a new wave of pain that kept him alert. He looked at the row of bullets on the stone and felt a grim satisfaction. He was still Chris Evans, and he was still armed. The Marshals had not yet taken the corral, and as long as the sun was down, he held the ground. The night was a temporary reprieve, a bridge of shadows between the blood of the evening and the final storming of the morning. He waited in the silence, a man of iron and grit, watching the moon cross the sky over the shattered remains of his refuge. The physical toll of the evening had been immense, stripping the outlaws of their strength, their health, and in Evans' case, his sight. Yet the narrative of their resistance continued to build with every hour they held the corral. The Marshals, too, were being tested by the environment and the stubbornness of their prey. The Stone Corral had become a crucible, a place where the human spirit was hammered by the heat and the metal until only the most basic elements of survival remained. The transition from evening to night was complete, leaving the participants in a state of suspended violence, waiting for the first light of June 12th to bring the final bloody resolution. Evans felt the weight of his years and his injuries as he sat in the dark. He was a man who had lived by the gun and was now prepared to die by it, a literal interpretation of the path he had chosen at 7 Mile Switch. He looked at Sontag one last time, then turned his focus back to the gap in the rocks. The silence was his only companion, a heavy, airless quiet that seemed to vibrate with the tension of the coming dawn. He was the last defender of the Stone Corral, a one-eyed ghost in a landscape of ruins waiting for the Marshals to come storming in to finish the work they had started in the heat of the afternoon. 4:45 in the morning began with a faint gray light bleeding over the sharp crests of the Sierra Nevada. The temperature had dropped to 72 degrees, providing a brief, deceptive coolness before the inevitable return of the valley heat. Chris Evans lay flat against the earth, his body a map of trauma and localized infections. His left eye was a mass of black congealed blood, and his left hand was a useless, swollen appendage of shattered bone and torn skin. He realized that remaining within the Stone Corral meant certain death once the sun rose high enough for the Marshals to see the interior clearly. He looked at John Sontag, who remained motionless in the crevice, his breathing so shallow that it failed to move the dust on his upper lip. Evans reached out with his right hand and squeezed Sontag's shoulder, receiving no response. The younger man was alive only in a technical, biological sense, his brain having retreated from the agony of his 7 gunshot wounds. Evans made the decision to leave the protection of the rocks at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning. He did not intend to abandon Sontag, but hoped to reach a small cabin approximately 200 yards to the west where he might find a horse or a distraction to draw the posse away. He began the process of moving his body across the dirt, a task that required an immense expenditure of physical energy. He used his right elbow and his right knee to drag himself forward, his chest scraping over the sharp fragments of granite and spent brass casings. Every inch of progress was a battle against the friction of the earth and the gravitational pull on his mangled limbs. He moved with the slow, rhythmic persistence of a wounded predator, his single remaining eye focused on the dark silhouette of the brush line. The mechanics of the crawl were brutal and literal. Evans had to lift his head every few feet to ensure he was moving in a straight line, a motion that exposed the back of his neck to the potential fire of the deputies on the ridge. He felt the grit of the alkaline soil entering the open wound in his eye socket, a sensation of sharp needles grinding against the exposed nerves. He did not cry out, his vocal cords being too parched and constricted by thirst to produce anything more than a dry, clicking sound. He reached the edge of the stone wall and paused, his body shaking with a violent tremor as the adrenaline began to wear off. He looked back at the corral, seeing the white scars on the rocks where the bullets had struck during the previous 14 hours of combat. Marshal George E. Guard and his deputies were positioned in a tight perimeter, their eyes straining to penetrate the morning gloom. They had not slept, their bodies fueled by coffee and the singular focus of the hunt. Vic Paquette sat behind his oak tree, the barrels of his shotgun resting on a flat stone. He saw a slight movement in the tall golden grass at 5:15 in the morning, a ripple that did not match the direction of the wind. He did not fire immediately, wanting to ensure the target was not a stray animal or a trick of the light. He signaled to Deputy Henderson to his left, pointing toward the area of the disturbance. The marshals were patient, utilizing the superior visibility of the dawn to track the slow progress of the man in the dirt. The physical landscape through which Evans crawled was a maze of sagebrush, manzanita, and sharp volcanic stones. The grass was dry enough to crackle under his weight, a sound that seemed deafening in the absolute silence of the morning. Evans used his right hand to part the stalks of grass before he slid forward, trying to minimize the visual impact of his movement. He found a discarded tin cup near a bush and gripped it, the metal cool against his skin. He hoped it might contain a few drops of dew, but it was bone dry, another reminder of the environmental hostility of the San Joaquin. He pushed the cup aside and continued, his mind devoid of white noise and the mechanical necessity of the next 3 inches of movement. By 5:30 in the morning, Evans had covered 40 yards, leaving a distinct trail of dark, smeared blood and flattened grass behind him. His progress was slowed by the recurring spasms in his wounded hip, which threatened to lock his leg in a useless position. He reached a small depression in the ground and rolled into it, seeking a moment of rest. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, the exertion causing his vision in his right eye to blur and pulse. He looked up at the sky, seeing the first pink and orange streaks of the sunrise. He knew he had less than 20 minutes before the light became a lethal liability. He took a shallow breath, tasted the copper of his own lungs, and pushed himself out of the hollow. The deputies on the ridgeline began to fire sporadic shots at 5:45 in the morning, aiming for the areas of the brush where they suspected the outlaw was hiding. A high-velocity slug from a Winchester passed within 6 inches of Evans' head, the concussive force of the air making his ear ring. He pressed his face into the dirt, inhaling the scent of dry earth and decaying vegetation. He did not return fire. He had only 11 rounds of ammunition left, and his rifle was currently strapped to his back, the weight of the steel and wood pressing into his spine. He remained motionless for 3 minutes, allowing the deputies to believe they had missed or that the movement was merely a phantom of the shadows. John Sontag remained behind in the Stone Corral, a silent witness to the departure of his partner. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a stray hawk circled over the rock circle, its shadow passing over Sontag's gray, ash-colored face. The younger man's body had reached a state of near rigidity, the muscles in his legs having cramped and stayed locked in place. He was a biological ruin, a testament to the sheer brute force of the ammunition the Marshals had expended. Within the corral, the silence was absolute, the roar of the previous day's battle replaced by the hum of flies beginning to congregate on the cooling blood. Sontag was a man of 32 who had been reduced to a heap of rags and trauma in the span of less than 24 hours. The technical advantage of the posse was highlighted at 6:15 in the morning when the sun finally cleared the peaks, illuminating the plateau with a brilliant, unforgiving light. The shadows that Evans had relied on vanished, leaving the golden grass looking translucent and thin. Marshal Guard stood up and adjusted his binoculars, scanning the field. He saw the trail of blood and the flattened vegetation leading away from the corral. He realized that one of the outlaws was attempting an escape and ordered his men to close the circle. "He's in the brush," Guard shouted, his voice carrying clearly across the dry air. "Move, and slow. He's still got teeth." Evans heard the command and realized his stealth had failed. He abandoned the slow crawl and attempted to rise to his knees, his body screaming in protest. He managed to pull his Winchester from his back, his right hand gripping the stock with a desperate intensity. He saw the silhouettes of the deputies moving toward him, their rifles leveled and their faces grim. He fired a single shot toward the nearest man, the recoil of the rifle knocking him backward. The bullet missed the deputy but struck a stone nearby, the whine of the ricochet serving as a warning. Evans began to move faster now, a frantic dragging motion that tore the skin from his elbows and knees. The brutality of the situation intensified as the deputies began a coordinated volley of fire into the brush where Evans was moving. The bullets shredded the sagebrush and kicked up fountains of dirt around the outlaw. One projectile struck the heel of Evans' boot, shearing off the leather and bruising his foot, but he did not stop. He was within 50 yards of a dense thicket of scrub oak that offered more substantial cover than the grass. He used the butt of his rifle as a cane, pushing himself forward with every ounce of his remaining strength. He was a man possessed by a singular mechanical drive to survive, a brute force of will that ignored the physical reality of his destruction. By 6:30 in the morning, the heat had already begun to rise, the temperature reaching 85 degrees. The sweat poured down Evans' face, stinging his good eye and making his grip on the rifle slick. He reached the edge of the scrub oak and dove into the shadows, the low-hanging branches scratching his face and tearing at his clothes. He lay there, gasping for air, his lungs feeling as though they were filled with hot sand. He looked out through the leaves and saw the Marshals forming a skirmish line 30 yards away. They were moving with a clinical precision, their eyes scanning every inch of the thicket. Evans knew he was cornered, but the cover of the oaks gave him a slight tactical advantage for a final stand. The deputies halted their advance at 6:45 in the morning, realizing that entering the thicket would be a high-risk maneuver against a desperate man with a rifle. Marshal Guard ordered a ceasefire and called for the supply wagon to bring more water to the front line. The lawmen sat in the grass, their eyes fixed on the oaks while they drank and reloaded their magazines. The psychological pressure of the weight was intended to wear down Evans' resolve, a tactic that had been used successfully throughout the hunt. Inside the thicket, Evans felt the silence as a physical weight, the lack of noise making the throbbing of his wounds seem louder. The physical condition of the environment was a factor in the stalemate. The scrub oak was dense and filled with dry, brittle wood that would snap if someone tried to move through it quietly. This meant that Evans would hear the deputies long before they saw him. He adjusted his position, sitting with his back against a gnarled oak trunk and placing his remaining 10 rounds of ammunition on his lap. He used a piece of his shirt to wipe the grime from the rifle's sights, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a professional in the midst of a massacre, a man who understood the mechanics of the kill and was prepared to apply them one last time. At 7 o'clock in the morning, a deputy named Hall attempted to flank the thicket from the west. He moved cautiously, his rifle held at his shoulder. Evans saw the glint of the man's badge through the leaves and waited until the deputy was within 20 yards. He fired a single, aimed shot that struck the ground between the man's feet, sending a spray of gravel into the deputy's shins. Hall retreated immediately, diving into a gully and returning fire blindly. The exchange triggered another general volley from the posse, the bullets, thudding into the oak trunks and showering Evans in bark and splintered wood. The history of the West was being finalized in this small patch of California dirt. The outlaws were no longer the fast-riding bandits of the newspapers. They were broken, bleeding men fighting for a few more minutes of breath. Evans looked at his mangled hand and felt a strange sense of detachment. The hand didn't feel like it belonged to him anymore. It was merely a piece of damaged meat that he had to carry. He focused on his right hand and the trigger of the Winchester, the only parts of his body that still functioned with any purpose. He was the last of a breed, a remnant of a violent era that was being crushed by the organized power of the Marshals. John Sontag's state in the Stone Corral at 7:15 in the morning was one of total stasis. A group of 3 deputies approached the southern entrance of the rocks, their shotguns ready. They saw Sontag lying in the crevice and fired a warning shot over his head. When the outlaw did not move, they moved closer, their boots crunching on the spent brass. They reached the body and realized that Sontag was still alive, though he was entirely unresponsive. One deputy kicked the rifle away from Sontag's hand, the weapon clattering against the stones. They did not attempt to provide medical aid, instead standing over the dying man and watching the thicket where Evans was hidden. The technology of the era, the repeating rifle and the high-velocity ammunition, had turned the Stone Corral and the surrounding field into a landscape of industrial-scale trauma. The outlaws had been hit more times than most men could survive, their bodies held together by the sheer brute force of their physical conditioning. Evans sat in the oaks, his mind drifting in and out of a light, feverish sleep. He imagined he could hear the sound of the train at 7 Mile Switch, the rhythmic thumping of the locomotive matching the beat of his own heart. He woke, with a start as a branch snapped nearby, his hand instantly tightening on the rifle. By 7:30 in the morning, the sun was high enough to begin heating the air inside the thicket. The shade of the oaks provided some relief, but the lack of air movement made the atmosphere stifling. Evans felt the onset of a profound thirst that overshadowed the pain of his wounds. His tongue felt like a piece of dry leather, and his throat was so raw that it hurt to swallow. He saw a small puddle of stagnant water near a root and considered crawling to it, but he knew the movement would expose him to the deputies. He remained where he was, a prisoner of his own tactical necessity. The scale of the hunt was evident in the number of men now surrounding the thicket. Marshal Guard had recruited 5 more special deputies from a nearby ranch, bringing the total number of lawmen to over 25. They formed a solid ring around the oaks, their weapons covering every possible exit. The outlaws were no longer a threat to the regional order. They were a localized problem that was being systematically solved with a superior volume of ammunition. Guard checked his watch and realized the fight had been going on for over 18 hours. He was determined to end it before the heat of the day reached its peak. The brutality of the situation was reflected in the appearance of the Marshals. Their clothes were caked with dust and their eyes were red from the glare of the sun. They were not heroes in a story, they were tired, angry men who wanted to finish a difficult job and go home. They viewed Evans not as a legend, but as a dangerous animal that needed to be put down. This lack of sentimentality was a hallmark of the late 19th century lawman, a professional detachment that prioritized efficiency over drama. They waited for the order to charge, their fingers resting on the triggers of their Winchesters. At 7:45 in the morning, Evans realized he could no longer hold the rifle steady. The weakness from the blood loss and the dehydration was finally overcoming his will. He leaned the Winchester against the tree and drew his revolver, a Colt .45 with a 5-inch barrel. It was lighter and easier to manage with his right hand. He checked the cylinder, finding 6 rounds of ammunition. This was his last line of defense, the final tool of his trade. He sat in the dirt, his back against the tree, and waited for the sound of the Marshals coming through the brush. He felt a strange sense of peace, the struggle of the crawl and the heat finally receding into the background. The environment of the thicket was a quiet, green world that seemed disconnected from the violence outside. The birds had returned to the branches, their songs a sharp contrast to the roar of the rifles. Evans watched a small lizard crawl across a stone, its movements quick and efficient. He felt a kinship with the creature, a fellow inhabitant of the dry foothills. The historical context of his life, the robberies, the escapes, and the gunfights seemed far away and insignificant compared to the immediate sensation of the oak bark against his spine. He was a man reduced to his most basic biological elements, waiting for the end of his time. Marshal Guard ordered a final advance at 8 o'clock in the morning. The deputies moved forward in a crouch, their rifles at the ready. They entered the thicket from 3 sides, the sound of the snapping branches echoing through the oaks. Evans heard them coming and raised his revolver, but his hand was shaking so violently that he couldn't aim. He saw the blue of a uniform through the leaves and pulled the trigger, the shot booming in the confined space. The bullet struck a branch, sending a shower of leaves into the air. The deputies responded with a concentrated volley of shotgun fire that shredded the foliage around Evans. The mechanical process of the surrender was not an act of choice, but one of total physical failure. Evans tried to cock the hammer of the Colt for a second shot, but his thumb lacked the strength to move the metal. He felt a wave of dizziness and slumped forward, the revolver falling from his hand and disappearing into the leaf litter. He lay on his side, his good eye staring at the roots of the tree. He heard the sound of the Marshals' boots as they surrounded him, their voices loud and triumphant. One deputy stepped forward and pressed the muzzle of a shotgun against Evans' neck, while another reached down and pulled the outlaw's hands behind his back. The brutality of the capture was immediate. They rolled Evans onto his back, the movement causing him to cry out in pain as his shattered hand was jarred. They didn't speak to him, instead performing a quick search for hidden weapons. They found the remaining rounds of ammunition and the pocket knife he had used to clean his rifle. Marshal Guard walked into the thicket and looked down at the mangled man in the dirt. He didn't say anything, merely nodding to his deputies to begin the process of moving the prisoner toward the wagon. The fight was over, and the hunt that had lasted for over a year had reached its definitive conclusion. By 8:15 in the morning, Evans was being carried out of the thicket on a makeshift stretcher made of blankets and rifles. He was a horrific sight, his face a mask of blood and dust, his clothes shredded, and his body covered in wounds. The deputies carried him toward the supply wagon, where a local doctor was waiting with a bag of instruments and a bottle of morphine. The physical scale of the battle was visible in the debris that littered the field, a landscape of broken wood and metal that would remain for years as a monument to the violence of 1893. The storming of the Stone Corral and the capture of Chris Evans marked the end of an era. The Outlaws had been held off for days by a posse that utilized every technological and environmental advantage available. The sheer brute force of the law had finally overcome the individual resilience of the fugitives. As Evans was lifted into the wagon, he looked toward the Stone Corral, where Sontag was also being moved. They were no longer the kings of the Sierras. They were broken men who would soon face the cold reality of the legal system. The morning sun continued to rise, its light a harsh reminder of the new day that had begun without them. The mechanical transition from combatant to prisoner was complete. The Marshals began the process of packing their gear and organizing the long ride back to Visalia. They moved with a sense of relief, the tension of the last 24 hours finally beginning to dissipate. The history of the Stone Corral would be told in the newspapers and the courtrooms, but for the men on the plateau, it was a physical memory of heat, blood, and the smell of gunpowder. The dawn crawl of Chris Evans had been a final, desperate act of defiance that ultimately led to the very end he had tried so hard to avoid. As the wagon began to move, the sound of the wheels on the dry earth was a steady, rhythmic percussion. Evans closed his good eye, the darkness a welcome relief from the glare of the sun. He felt the sway of the wagon and the vibration of the road, the sensations of a world that he was no longer a part of. He was a prisoner of the state, a man whose time had run out in the rocks of the Sierra Nevada. The story of the Stone Corral had reached its climax, leaving only the aftermath of the blood and the justice that would follow in the heat of the California summer. Marshal Guard ordered his men to clear the remaining crevices, ensuring no other associates of the Evans and Sontag gang were hidden within the geological labyrinth. The deputies moved through the corral with a mechanical efficiency, using their rifle barrels to probe the shadows behind the larger boulders. They found hundreds of additional brass shells tucked into the cracks of the rocks, proof that the Outlaws had utilized every available inch of the corral as a magazine. The scale of the defense was revealed to be a masterpiece of improvised masonry, with Sontag and Evans having moved smaller stones to create firing slits that protected their vitals while allowing them a wide field of fire. The brutality of the injuries sustained by Sontag became the focal point of the Marshals' attention once the area was secured. A local physician who had traveled with the posse from Visalia was summoned to the center of the corral at 10:30 in the morning. He knelt in the dirt, his black medical bag looking out of place against the backdrop of the shattered rocks. He began the process of cutting away Sontag's shirt, revealing the horrific extent of the ballistics damage. One bullet had passed through the right lung, while another had shattered the pelvic girdle, leaving a jagged exit wound that had bled out into the earth. The doctor shook his head, noting that the infection had already begun to set in due to the heat and the lack of sterile water. The environment within the Stone Corral acted as a natural kiln, trapping the heat and intensifying the smell of the blood that had soaked into the soil. As the sun reached its zenith, the moisture began to evaporate from the dark stains on the ground, leaving behind a crust of salt and iron. The deputies stood in a loose circle around the wounded man, their shadows falling across his face. There was no conversation among the lawmen. The sight of Sontag's mangled body had a sobering effect on the men who had spent the previous day trying to kill him. They were witnesses to a level of physical endurance that defied the medical expectations of the era, a raw display of human resilience in the face of industrial-scale violence. The technology of the era was represented by the various weapons that were collected from the site as evidence. In addition to the Winchester rifles, the deputies found a pair of heavy-caliber revolvers and a collection of handmade cartridges that had been reinforced with extra powder. These items were cataloged by Marshal Guard, who understood the historical value of the hardware used in the engagement. The rifles were scarred by ricochets and the barrels were still warm to the touch from the ambient temperature. These mechanical tools were the only things that had functioned reliably throughout the siege, providing the outlaws with the means to hold off a superior force for over 24 hours. At 10:45 in the morning, the process of transporting Sontag out of the corral began. Because of the rugged terrain, a standard wagon could not reach the center of the rock formation. The deputies were forced to construct a litter using 2 sturdy pine branches and a heavy wool blanket. They lifted Sontag with a synchronized movement, the outlaw's body sagging under the weight of his own trauma. As they moved him, the sound of his bones grinding together was audible to those standing nearby, a sickening literal reminder of the damage done by the posse's rifles. He was carried through the northern breach, his head lolling to the side as he slipped back into a state of unconsciousness. The scale of the ammunition expended was finalized during a count conducted by the deputies before they abandoned the site. They estimated that over 2,000 rounds had been fired by the posse alone, an average of nearly 100 shots for every man involved in the hunt. This volume of fire was unprecedented in the history of the San Joaquin Valley, reflecting the railroad's demand for the total suppression of the outlaws. The ground inside the corral was so heavily littered with metal that it crunched like gravel under the men's boots. This layer of copper and lead-free alloy would remain in the soil for decades, a permanent geological record of the battle that had occurred in June 1893. The historical context of the storming was one of total finality for the Sontag and Evans gang. With Chris Evans already in custody and John Sontag being carried toward a likely death, the reign of the train robbers was effectively over. Marshal Guard looked back at the Stone Corral one last time before mounting his horse, seeing the white scars on the gray granite as a testament to the power of the law. He had utilized the brute force of logistics, the reach of the telegraph, and the accuracy of the modern rifle to dismantle a legend. The corral was no longer a fortress, it was a crime scene, a place where the lawless elements of the Old West had been hammered into submission. By 11 o'clock in the morning, the heat had reached 97 degrees and the air was thick with the dust kicked up by the departing horses. The posse began the long trek back toward the lowlands, the litter carrying Sontag positioned in the center of the column. The physical exertion of the move was immense, with the deputies taking turns carrying the heavy branches. They moved with a grim, purposeful gait, their eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of local sympathizers who might attempt a last-minute rescue. The brutality of the situation was reflected in the silence of the march, a contrast to the jubilant shouts that had accompanied the initial capture of Evans. Sontag's condition continued to fluctuate as the column moved down the rocky slopes. The jolting motion of the litter caused the wounds to reopen, leaving a trail of red spots on the golden grass. Every few hundred yards, the doctor would stop the column to check the outlaw's pulse, which remained a thin, thready vibration in his wrist. The physical reality of the situation was a slow, agonizing race against the heat and the blood loss. Sontag was being kept alive by the sheer momentum of the event, a biological anomaly that fascinated the men who had spent the night in the shadows of the rocks. He was a prisoner of his own injuries, held in place by the very trauma that threatened to end him. The mechanics of the landscape presented one final challenge as the posse reached the edge of the plateau and began the descent into the canyon. The trail was narrow and filled with loose shale, making the footing treacherous for the men carrying the litter. They were forced to lower Sontag down the steeper sections using ropes, a process that required the brute force of 6 men working in unison. The outlaw groaned as the litter tilted, his hand reaching out to grip the fabric of the blanket with a desperate, instinctive strength. This struggle against the geography of the Sierras was a fitting conclusion to a hunt that had been defined by the ruggedness of the terrain. As they reached the valley floor at 11:30 in the morning, the temperature spiked to over 100 degrees. The humidity from the nearby creeks added a layer of discomfort to the heat. making the air feel thick and heavy. The supply wagon was waiting at a prearranged junction, its driver standing by the horses with a look of apprehension. The deputies carefully lifted Sontag into the back of the wagon, placing him on a bed of hay that had been dampened with water to provide some cooling. Evans was already in the wagon, his head bandaged and his good eye closed against the light. The two partners were reunited in the wreckage of their defeat, their bodies a testament to the cost of their defiance. The transition from the Stone Corral to the road back to Visalia marked the beginning of the legal phase of the pursuit. Marshal Guard sat on his horse watching the wagon begin its slow journey across the flatlands. He felt the weight of the responsibility he had carried for the past several weeks, the pressure from the railroad and the government finally beginning to lift. He had accomplished his objective through the systematic application of force and the refusal to engage in negotiations. The storming of the corral had been the final, decisive act of a campaign that had changed the way the law was enforced in the state of California. Inside the wagon, the physical reality of the situation was one of intense suffering. The smell of the hay and the horse sweat mixed with the scent of the outlaws' wounds, creating a nauseating atmosphere. Evans occasionally reached over to touch Sontag's hand, a small gesture of recognition that was ignored by the deputies guarding them. The outlaws were no longer the predators of the 7-mile switch. They were the quarry, broken and bound for the jailhouse. The historical significance of their capture was already being processed by the news reporters who waited in Visalia, their telegraph keys ready to broadcast the details of the fight to the nation. The brutality of the battle was evidenced by the physical appearance of the deputies as they rode alongside the wagon. Their faces were caked with a mixture of sweat and dust that had hardened into a gray mask, and their eyes were bloodshot from the lack of sleep. They were tired, hungry, and thirsty, their bodies pushed to the edge of endurance by the demands of the siege. This was the grit of the frontier, a reality far removed from the romanticized versions of the West that were popular in the East. It was a matter of blood, sweat, and the relentless application of superior firepower. The scale of the hunt was reflected in the financial cost that continued to accumulate even as the posse returned. The Southern Pacific Railroad had authorized a payment of $5,000 for the capture, a sum that would be divided among the men who had stood on the ridges. This bounty was a driving force behind the relentlessness of the pursuit, a financial incentive that ensured the law would not stop until the outlaws were caught. The investment had paid off, providing the railroad with a definitive victory and a clear message to any others who might consider challenging their authority. As the wagon reached the outskirts of Visalia at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, the crowd began to gather along the road. The people watched in silence as the battered vehicle passed, their eyes fixed on the two figures in the back. The sight of Sontag and Evans, once the most feared men in the region, now reduced to a state of near death, had a profound impact on the local populace. The legend was being replaced by the reality of the wounds and the chains. The transition was complete. The outlaws had been brought back from the wilderness to face the consequences of their actions in the heart of the community. The technology of the town, the brick buildings, the paved streets, and the telegraph lines stood in stark contrast to the primitive violence of the Stone Corral. The outlaws were being brought from the world of the granite and the Winchester into the world of the judge and the jury. This shift represented the modernization of the West, where the rule of law was enforced by organized agencies and industrial resources. The storming of the corral had been the final obstacle to this transition, a physical barrier that had been dismantled by the brute force of the Marshals. Marshal Guard led the column into the courtyard of the jail at 12:15 in the afternoon, his duty almost complete. He dismounted and watched as Sontag was carried into the infirmary, the outlaws breathing still a labored, wet sound. Evans was assisted from the wagon, his gait slow and unsteady, his mangled hand held close to his chest. The two men were separated, one headed for the surgeon's table and the other for a reinforced cell. The Battle of the Stone Corral had ended, but the story of the Outlaws would continue through the trials and the historical accounts that followed. The physical landscape of the Stone Corral remained behind, a silent witness to the events of June 1893. The rocks were still scarred, the ground was still littered with metal, and the air still held the scent of the fight. It was a place that had been permanently changed by the intersection of human desperation and legal force. The history of the site would be one of blood and grit, a literal manifestation of the struggle for control over the Sierra Nevada. As the sun continued its path across the sky, the silence returned to the corral, leaving only the memories of the guns and the men who had fought behind the stone walls. The mechanics of the storming had been a masterpiece of tactical execution, a credit to the discipline of the Marshals and the planning of William Guard. They had managed to take two of the most dangerous men in the territory with a minimum of loss to their own side. The brute force of the ambush and the siege had worked, providing a blueprint for future law enforcement operations in the West. The era of the lone outlaw was being replaced by the era of the professional agency, a change that was finalized in the dust and the heat of the Stone Corral. As the afternoon progressed, the details of the fight were being telegraphed to the major newspapers in San Francisco and Los Angeles. The story of the outlaws who held off a posse for days behind stone walls was becoming national news, capturing the imagination of the public. However, the reality for Sontag and Evans was one of pain and isolation. They were no longer the masters of their own fate, but characters in a larger narrative of legal and industrial progress. The brutality of their situation was the price they paid for their defiance, a debt that was now being collected by the state. The scale of the battle, from the number of rounds fired to the severity of the injuries, solidified its place in the annals of Western history. It was a fight of unprecedented intensity, a localized war that represented the larger conflict between the old ways and the new. The Stone Corral was the stage for this drama, a geological feature that had been transformed into a historical landmark by the events of June 11th and 12th. The final storming had been the closing act of this drama, a moment of high tension and violent resolution that would be remembered for generations. Marshal Guard sat in his office at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, writing his official report of the engagement. He described the arrival at the corral, the intensity of the firefight, and the eventual capture of the fugitives. He used the literal language of a professional lawman, focusing on the facts and the outcomes. He noted the bravery of his deputies and the effectiveness of the coordination between the different agencies. His report was a document of the New West, a record of a successful operation conducted with the efficiency of the modern age. The morning of June 12, 1893 ended with the outlaws in custody and the Stone Corral abandoned to the elements. The sun continued to bake the plateau, its light reflecting off the white scars on the rocks. The blood in the dirt had dried, and the flies had found their way to the remnants of the fight. The silence was absolute, a heavy, airless quiet that seemed to vibrate with the memory of the rifles. The hunt was over, the battle was won, and the history of the Sontag and Evans gang was being written in the dust of the California foothills. John Sontag's life hung by a thread in the Visalia infirmary, his body a map of the trauma he had endured behind the stone walls. Chris Evans sat in his cell, his good eye staring at the brick walls, his mind perhaps reflecting on the journey that had led him from 7 Mile Switch to this place. They were the survivors of the Stone Corral, the human remnants of a violent collision between two eras of the American West. The story of their resistance would live on, a gritty, literal account of the day the outlaws held off the law until the Marshals came storming in. June 13th, 1893 at 8 o'clock in the morning found the town of Visalia transformed into a hub of medical and judicial activity. The transition from the violent geography of the Stone Corral to the sterile, organized environment of the county hospital marked the final phase of the Sontag and Evans saga. John Sontag lay on a galvanized steel operating table, his body a collection of trauma points that challenged the limits of 19th-century surgical knowledge. The air in the room was saturated with the sharp chemical scent of carbolic acid and the metallic tang of dried blood. Dr. Miller, the lead surgeon, worked with a mechanical precision, using silver probes to locate the copper-jacketed projectiles that remained lodged near Sontag's spine and within his thoracic cavity. Each piece of metal removed was dropped into a ceramic bowl, the sharp clink echoing against the tiled walls and serving as a rhythmic tally of the previous 48 hours of combat. The physical condition of John Sontag was classified as critical by 9 o'clock in the morning. The 7 distinct entry wounds had introduced significant amounts of dirt, clothing fibers, and environmental bacteria into his internal systems, triggering a systemic infection that the available antibiotics of 1893 could not suppress. His core body temperature spiked to 104 degrees, a physiological response to the massive tissue damage and the loss of nearly 40% of his total blood volume. He remained in a state of semi-consciousness, his breathing a mechanical, labored whistle through the fluid accumulating in his damaged lung. The nurses used sponges soaked in ice water to dab at his forehead, but the heat of his fever evaporated the moisture almost as soon as it touched his skin. Chris Evans was situated in a separate high-security ward on the second floor of the Visalia jail, which had been converted into a temporary medical annex. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a different team of specialists began the process of addressing the destruction of his left eye. The globe had been completely perforated by a stone fragment and a stray pellet, necessitating a total enucleation to prevent the onset of sympathetic ophthalmia in his remaining good eye. Evans refused the administration of ether, choosing instead to grip the edges of the wooden bed frame while the surgeon utilized a series of curved scissors and forceps to remove the ruined tissue. His face was a mask of stoic endurance, the only sign of his agony being the white-knuckle grip he maintained on the timber and the heavy perspiration that soaked through his canvas hospital gown. The mechanical reality of the Outlaws' capture was reflected in the inventory of items processed by the county clerk at 11:15 in the morning. The 2 Winchester Model 1892 rifles, now officially designated as evidence, were placed in a locked wooden crate. Their barrels were found to be slightly warped from the heat of the sustained fire, and the internal actions were jammed with a mixture of carbonized powder and alkaline sand. Along with the rifles, the clerk cataloged 44 rounds of unfired ammunition, 2 blood-stained hats, and a pocket watch with a cracked glass face. These objects were the physical residue of a year of evasion, the cold hardware that had facilitated the robberies in the final stand at the Stone Corral. They were no longer tools of survival. They were exhibits for a future trial. By noon on June 13th, the Southern Pacific Railroad had already dispatched a team of private investigators to Visalia to verify the identities of the prisoners. They carried high-resolution photographic plates taken after the 7-Mile Switch robbery to compare with the physical features of the wounded men. The process was purely clinical. The agents measured the distance between the eyes, the shape of the jawline, and the specific scarring on Sontag's leg, to ensure the $5,000 bounty would be paid to the correct members of the posse. This verification process was conducted with the same industrial efficiency that characterized the railroad's business operations. The outlaws were treated as inventory to be accounted for, their human suffering being an incidental byproduct of the legal and financial settlement. John Sontag's biological functions began to fail systematically at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. His kidneys, overwhelmed by the byproduct of muscle breakdown and the lack of hydration during the siege, ceased to produce urine. This led to an accumulation of toxins in his bloodstream, causing a yellowing of the sclera in his eyes and a deepening of the gray pallor on his skin. Despite the gravity of his state, he regained a brief moment of lucidity, asking for a drink of water. When the cup was held to his lips, he found he could not swallow, the muscles in his throat having been compromised by the shock to his nervous system. He stared at the ceiling for several minutes, his fingers picking at the threads of the hospital blanket, before slipping back into a deep, uremic coma from which he would not recover. The legal machinery of the state of California moved with a speed that matched the medical interventions. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the district attorney filed formal charges of murder, train robbery, and assault with intent to kill against both Evans and Sontag. The paperwork was typed on a manual Remington typewriter, the rhythmic clack of the keys signaling the transition from the lawless violence of the foothills to the structured order of the courtroom. The historical context of the West was being rewritten in these documents. The narrative of the bandit was being replaced by the record of the felon. The Stone Corral was cited as the primary location of the final criminal act, its granite walls now part of a legal description, rather than a physical fortress. Chris Evans' left hand was addressed by a bone specialist at 4:45 in the afternoon. The two shattered fingers were found to be beyond repair, the bone having been pulverized into dozens of small fragments by the falling rock. The surgeon performed a partial amputation, removing the digits at the second knuckle to prevent the spread of gangrene. Evans watched the procedure with a detached interest, his mind likely focused on the logistical reality of his upcoming incarceration. He understood that his career as a marksman was over. Without his depth perception and with a mangled hand, he was no longer a threat to the Southern Pacific. He was a 50-year-old man with a family he would likely never see again outside of a visitor's cage. The scale of the public interest in the events reached its peak at 5 o'clock in the evening when the first editions of the San Francisco newspapers arrived in Visalia by rail. The headlines described the butcher's bill at the Stone Corral and provided a detailed tally of the ammunition expended and the injuries sustained. The brute force of the Marshals' response was celebrated in the press as a triumph of civilization over the remnants of the frontier. The technological disparity between the two sides was highlighted, with particular attention paid to the use of dynamite and long-range optics. To the public, the Outlaws were now historical curiosities, their capture representing the definitive end of the era of the great train robberies in the San Joaquin. At exactly 6 o'clock in the evening on July 3, 1893, John Sontag died in custody at the Fresno County Jail Infirmary after weeks of fever and infection. His heart simply stopped beating, unable to maintain the electrical impulses required to move blood through his traumatized organs. There were no dramatic last words. The room was silent except for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Deputies standing guard at the door noted the time in a small leather notebook and signaled for the orderlies to move the body to the morgue. Sontag was 32 years old, and he had lived his final 3 weeks in a state of physical agony that few men could endure. His death was a biological necessity, the final resolution of the 7 high-velocity projectiles that had entered his body on June 11th. The mechanics of Sontag's burial were conducted with the same lack of sentimentality that had characterized the hunt. Because no family members came forward to claim the body immediately, the county was responsible for the arrangements. At 7:15 in the evening, a plain pine coffin was delivered to the morgue. Sontag's body was placed inside without being washed or dressed in fresh clothes, the red dust of the Stone Corral still clinging to his skin. He was buried at Calvary Cemetery in Fresno, the earth being shoveled over the wood in the fading light of the day. The location of the grave was recorded in the county ledger. a single line of ink marking the end of a man who had once dominated the headlines of the state. The trial of Chris Evans began several months later, in the autumn of 1893, when his wounds had sufficiently scarred over. The courtroom in Fresno was packed with spectators who had traveled from as far away as Los Angeles to see the one-eyed bandit. Evans sat at the defense table, his eye patch and his bandaged hand serving as silent testimony to the violence of his capture. He was faced with a mountain of evidence, including the testimony of the deputies who had survived the firefight and the physical artifacts recovered from the corral. The prosecution focused on the cold, calculated nature of the train robberies, portraying Evans not as a social rebel but as a professional criminal who had cost the railroad thousands of dollars. The defense attempted to frame the actions of Evans and Sontag as a legitimate resistance against the Southern Pacific's land-grabbing policies. They called local farmers to the stand who testified to the railroad's predatory practices, hoping to sway the jury through shared resentment. However, the brutality of the deaths of the lawmen during the various skirmishes proved to be an insurmountable hurdle. The jury, composed of local merchants and property owners who valued the stability the railroad brought to the region, was not moved by the arguments of social justice. They saw only the blood in the dirt and the smoke of the dynamite. The trial lasted 3 weeks, each day filled with technical descriptions of ballistics and surgical procedures. In December 1893, Chris Evans was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment at Folsom State Prison. The judge, a man who had spent his career enforcing the expansion of the law into the foothills, delivered the sentence with a stern, unwavering voice. He noted that the Battle of the Stone Corral was a stain on the history of the county that could only be cleansed through the permanent removal of its participants from society. Evans received the sentence without visible emotion, his single eye fixed on a point above the judge's head. He was shackled at the wrists and ankles, the iron rings biting into his scarred skin, and led from the courtroom by a phalanx of armed guards. The transit to Folsom Prison was conducted via the very railroad Evans had spent years robbing. At 8 o'clock in the morning on January 5, 1894, he was loaded into a secure passenger car, his movements restricted by heavy chains. He watched the San Joaquin Valley pass by through the window, the golden hills where he had once hidden now appearing distant and unreachable. The irony of the situation was not lost on the guards, who joked about the outlaw finally paying for his ticket. Evans did not respond, remaining silent throughout the journey. He was a prisoner of the system he had tried to destroy, being carried toward a stone cell by the very steam and steel he had once sought to derail. The physical environment of Folsom Prison was a landscape of granite and iron that mirrored the Stone Corral in its hardness, but lacked its freedom. Evans was assigned to a cell in the old cell block, a space measuring 5 feet by 8 feet with walls of solid rock. The silence of the prison was a different kind of quiet than the silence of the mountains. It was a regulated, oppressive silence punctuated by the ringing of bells and the clink of keys. He spent his days in the prison quarry, using a sledgehammer to break apart the same type of granite that had once protected him during the siege. The labor was agonizing for a man with a mangled hand and limited vision, but he performed it without complaint, a mechanical shadow of the man he had been. Back at the Stone Corral, the landscape began to reclaim the site of the battle. The winter rains of 1894 washed the blood from the soil and smoothed the jagged edges of the shattered boulders. The golden grass grew back in the spring, hiding the thousands of brass casings that remained buried in the dirt. Only the white scars on the rocks remained as a visible reminder of the thousands of rounds that had been traded during the 2-day siege. The site became a destination for curious travelers who would poke through the brush looking for souvenirs of the famous fight. They found mostly rusted fragments of metal and the occasional button from a deputy's coat, the small literal remnants of a massive human conflict. The historical legacy of the Battle of the Stone Corral was cemented in the official reports of the United States Marshals Service. Marshal George E. Gard received a commendation for his leadership and the strategic use of force that led to the capture of the fugitives. His report was archived in Washington, D.C., a document that codified the transition of law enforcement in the West from a matter of individual bravery to a matter of organizational logistics. The use of the telegraph, the rail, and the coordinated posse at the Stone Corral became a case study for future generations of lawmen. The brute force of the state had been proven effective, signaling that the era of the wild frontier was definitively closed. Chris Evans remained in Folsom Prison for 17 years, his health gradually deteriorating in the damp, cold environment of the rock cells. He became a model prisoner, his violent past replaced by a quiet, brooding presence. In 1911, at the age of 64, he was granted a pardon by the governor of California, largely due to his advanced age and his failing eyesight. He returned to Visalia a broken man, a ghost from a previous century wandering the streets of a town that had been transformed by electricity and the automobile. The world of 1893 had vanished, replaced by a modern society that had no memory of the smell of black powder or the sound of the Winchester. The final years of Chris Evans were spent in relative obscurity. He lived with his daughter, spending his days sitting on the porch and staring toward the Sierra Nevada foothills. With his one remaining eye, he rarely spoke of Sontag or the night behind the stone walls, as if the memory were too heavy to be translated into words. He died in 1917, the same year the United States entered the First World War. His death was a small notice in the back of the local paper, a footnote in the history of a region that was now a global agricultural powerhouse. He was buried near his family, far from the plot at Calvary Cemetery in Fresno, where John Sontag lay. The Stone Corral remains today as a geological anomaly in the foothills, a circle of rocks that seems to hold the heat of the sun longer than the surrounding land. If a visitor looks closely at the granite faces, they can still see the pockmarks and the white streaks where the bullets struck over a century ago. The ground still contains the microscopic fragments of copper and iron, a metallic signature of the violence that erupted in June 1893. It is a place of absolute stillness, where the only sound is the wind moving through the dry grass. The story of the Outlaws and the Marshals is written in the masonry of the hills, a gritty literal account of a time when the West was won through the sheer brute force of superior fire and the relentless attrition of the law. The scale of the battle, with its thousands of rounds and horrific injuries, remains a benchmark for the violence of the era. It was a confrontation that lacked the glamour of the dime novels, defined instead by thirst, infection, and the slow mechanical failure of human bodies and steel machines. The transition from the 7-mile switch to the jailhouse cell was a trajectory of blood and stone, a path that led to the inevitable conclusion of all who challenged the industrial order of the 19th century. As the sun sets over the Stone Corral today, the shadows still stretch across the basin like the fingers of the Marshals, closing the circle on a history that was forged in the fire and the dust of 1893. The mechanics of the story are now complete. The outlaws are dead. The law has been upheld and the landscape has resumed its indifference. The Battle of the Stone Corral stands as a monument to the end of the outlaw trail, a place where the old ways died under the weight of the new. The grit and the brutality of the fight are the only things that remain, the literal sensations of the heat and the metal etched into the collective memory of the San Joaquin. The Marshals came storming in. The outlaws held their ground until they could hold it no more, and the history of the West moved on, leaving the rocks to hold the secrets of the blood spilled within their walls.